In the stillness of history, some truths flicker like distant lanterns, casting faint light across shadowed corridors we seldom visit. The Middle Ages, often imagined through the softened glow of cathedral windows or the steel shimmer of a knight's armor, were not merely an age of chivalry and devotion. They were a time shaped by hunger and silence, by fear and endurance, by systems so entrenched that entire generations lived and died without ever questioning their suffering. But these truths did not vanish. They sank, like stones beneath the surface of memory, waiting to be quietly uncovered. To truly see the Middle Ages as they were, one must look beyond the gilded manuscript pages and the romantic myths of courtly love. One must step into the muddy streets where plague carts passed, into the salt-scarred hands of women gutting fish along Mediterranean coasts, into the inner chambers of Mali where scribes copied texts by candlelight, knowing they would never leave their confines. There was violence, yes, but also despair that whispered through the ordinary, etched into the rituals of daily life. It is in these overlooked places that history speaks with a quieter, darker voice. Take, for instance, the year 1347, when rats disembarked silently in Sicilian ports, carrying with them the beginnings of the Black Death. It would take over 75 million lives before its slow retreat, but in its first moments, there was no panic, only coughing, then fevers, then silence. For most medieval people, illness was divine punishment, and healing a matter of faith rather than medicine. The sick were sometimes abandoned, their homes boarded up with them still inside. In Cairo, entire families vanished within days. In rural England, monks stopped ringing the bells. In the Levant, travelers wrote of cities where the only sound was the wind and the cries of stray dogs. But long before the plague arrived, darkness had already settled into the crevices of medieval life. Across much of Eurasia, the institution of slavery persisted in quieter forms than the chattel slavery of later centuries, but no less cruel. In the Abbasid Caliphate, young boys from Eastern Europe were captured or bought and trained as soldiers known as ghilman. Elite, loyal, and entirely cut off from their homelands. In West Africa, the Empire of Ghana trafficked in human lives alongside gold and salt. In India, certain castes were legally bound to perform degrading labor, forbidden from entering temples or even being touched. And in the bustling trade city of Venice, a person's status as free or unfree could turn on a single legal clause, one written in a language they might not even speak. These are not the stories often told in medieval dramas or schoolbook timelines. Yet they were the marrow of medieval life, the quiet, grinding structures that shaped how people lived, worked, worshipped, and died. There was no universal medieval experience, of course, but suffering had patterns, and so did power. In feudal Europe, peasants paid taxes in grain, days of labor, and sometimes their own children, sent to serve in noble households far from their homes. In Tang Dynasty China, orphans were conscripted into silk factories where the air was heavy with dye fumes. And in the Andes, long before Spanish contact, entire communities were relocated under the mita system, a labor draft that required families to contribute workers to vast imperial projects, many never returning. To wander through these truths is not to chase misery, but to better understand the foundation on which the present quietly rests. In the absence of modern comforts, running water, painkillers, the right to read or move freely, human beings carved meaning from ritual, myth, and memory. But always there was the shadow of coercion. A mother forced to give up her third child to the temple. A young girl sold into servitude in a city she couldn't name. A monk who stitched parchment in silence, forbidden from speaking for decades, knowing his only words might be written in the margins of sacred texts he would never claim as his own. And so, over the next 3 hours, we will drift gently through this world, across continents and centuries, unearthing the strangely quiet, hauntingly dark truths that filled the real Middle Ages. From the sacred to the brutal, from the expected to the long forgotten. Let us begin, not with the kings and wars, but with the subtle weight of survival and the rituals that kept people afloat in the long night of history. Far from the bustling markets of medieval Europe, beyond the caravan trails of Central Asia, and nestled high in the rugged, wind-worn plateaus of what is now Western China, there stood a network of remote Buddhist monasteries whose very silence held the weight of centuries. These were places of inward turning, of detachment from the world, and for some, of quiet suffering woven beneath the spiritual calm. For many listeners, the image of a Buddhist monk conjures peace, shaved heads, saffron robes, serene expressions under the Bodhi tree. Yet in the strictest sects of medieval monastic life, particularly during the Tang and Song dynasties, the path to enlightenment was often paved not only with meditation and study, but with long, grueling years of silence, austerity, and suppression. Within the cloisters of Chan Buddhist temples, which would later influence Zen traditions, monks undertook what were known as silent retreats, periods where speech was not merely discouraged, but strictly forbidden, sometimes for years at a time. This was not silence as tranquility, but silence as a spiritual trial. Novices were watched carefully, and even a whispered word could result in punishment, exclusion, or expulsion. In some temples, silence extended beyond speech. Gestures, written communication, even facial expressions were regulated. The absence of sound was thought to discipline the ego, sever worldly attachments, and bring clarity to the mind. But for many monks, especially those conscripted as children or entering without full understanding of the path, the experience became something else entirely: isolation, confusion, and spiritual paralysis. Some of these young novices arrived not through choice, but by necessity or coercion. Families facing famine or political instability might send their children to the monastery in hopes they would be fed and clothed, traded for a chance at survival. Others were orphaned by the frequent wars and peasant uprisings that racked parts of the Chinese countryside during the 9th and 10th centuries. And while temples were often refuges from violence, they were also governed by strict hierarchies, where junior monks had little agency and less voice. Punishments could be physical: beatings with rods, forced fasts, even isolation in cold stone cells known as jingzuo rooms, where one was expected to sit without moving for hours, days, or longer. Even outside the monastery walls, silence was a tool of order. In imperial China, entire populations were periodically resettled by force, entire villages relocated hundreds of miles, often without clear reasons or warning. Those who resisted faced brutal consequences. Under Emperor Tang Wuzong's reign, the state's crackdown on foreign religions included the closure of over 4,000 Buddhist monasteries and the forced secularization of hundreds of thousands of monks and nuns. These were not passive edicts. Troops were sent to dismantle statues, burn texts, and return temple land to the state. Monks who had taken lifelong vows were suddenly thrust into peasant life, given a plow instead of a prayer book. Some disappeared entirely, their fates unrecorded. What these episodes reveal is a deeper truth often missing from Western interpretations of Eastern spiritual life, that even practices rooted in peace can become entangled with power. The line between discipline and control, between sacrifice and submission, was thin and easily crossed. This is not to diminish the wisdom preserved in Buddhist teachings, nor the sincere devotion of countless monks and nuns who found meaning in their silence, but rather to remember that institutions, even spiritual ones, are shaped by the same forces of survival, hierarchy and suppression that defined much of the medieval world. In the margins of ancient scrolls from the Dunhuang caves, brief notes appear, likely scribbled by monks when no one was watching. Some are as simple as "I am cold" or "It has been 10 days." Others contain lines of poetry, desperate, beautiful, and anonymous. These tiny human fingerprints push through the centuries like cracks in the stone, reminders that even in silence, suffering leaves its trace. And so we move forward, carrying with us this truth, that silence in the Middle Ages was not always peace. Sometimes it was exile, sometimes it was survival, sometimes it was the only thing left to say. In the hills of medieval France, quiet stone convents rose among fields of lavender and wheat, their pale walls cloaked in ivy and prayer. These were places of order and rhythm, where bells marked the hours and silence curled through cloisters like incense. From a distance, the life of a nun may have seemed peaceful, removed from the chaos of feudal warfare, sheltered from the dangers of childbirth and hunger. Yet within the abbey walls, a different kind of control took root, one less visible, but no less binding. For many medieval women, the path to the convent was not a calling. It was a cage constructed by family, church, and law, sealed by vows they had little choice but to make. Daughters of noble families were often entered into religious life, while still children, pledged to the church as a way to protect family fortunes or solidify political alliances. A dowry paid to the convent would ensure her safe removal from the line of inheritance. No sons divided their land, no daughters demanded marriage portions. By cloistering her, the family secured its estate. The church in turn gained property, influence, and labor. What appeared as devotion was frequently the outcome of quiet coercion, a redirection of a girl's life before she ever had a chance to live it. Once enclosed, these women lived under the rule of Saint Benedict or similar monastic codes, which prescribed silence, obedience, and humility as daily disciplines. The very architecture of the convent reinforced this submission: narrow corridors, high walls, and latticework that obscured faces during Mass. Even when permitted to speak, nuns were expected to use specific regulated forms of address. Conversation was often restricted to necessities, with casual talk considered a distraction from divine focus. The loss of voice was not only literal, but symbolic, a ritual erasure of the self in favor of the collective identity as bride of Christ. Yet despite this suppression, traces of resistance endure. Some nuns wrote in secret or in coded texts, revealing inner lives that longed for freedom, knowledge, or even physical escape. Others found ways to subvert their confinement through music, composing complex plain-song chants that stretched the boundaries of accepted liturgical form. Still others used embroidery and manuscript illumination as acts of expression, hiding small personal motifs. A face, a flower, a tiny bird in the margins of holy garments or devotional books. These were not grand rebellions, but quiet testaments to agency within limitation. For women outside the convent, life could be even harsher. Medieval law codes in much of Western Europe placed women under the permanent legal guardianship of a father, brother, or husband. In marriage, a woman's property became her husband's, her body, his right. Church courts and canon law offered some protections, particularly against extreme abuse, but enforcement was inconsistent and often favored male testimony. A woman's word was worth less in court. Her education frequently limited to reading prayers, if she was literate at all. In some regions, noble women were educated by nuns or tutors, but even this learning was tightly bound by expectations of piety and obedience. The darkness of these restrictions extended into daily life. For rural peasant women, work was relentless. Tending fields, grinding grain, fetching water, raising children, and often doing so under the watchful eye of landlords or bailiffs who demanded impossible rents. In towns, guild restrictions often barred women from trades or limited them to the lowest paying roles. A widow might take over her husband's workshop, but only with special permission. The independence we imagine today, to walk alone, to read freely, to speak one's mind, was not only rare, it was actively discouraged. Even those who gained influence found their voices threatened. Consider Hildegard of Bingen, the famed German abbess and mystic, whose visions and writings reached popes and emperors. She was exceptional, and yet, late in life, her abbey was placed under interdict by church authorities for burying an excommunicated man on consecrated ground. The punishment, her nuns were barred from singing the divine office, silencing the very music that had defined their lives. It was a stark reminder that even revered women could be muted by the structures that surrounded them, and still, they persisted. In ink and cloth, in whispered prayers and hidden symbols, they left behind fragments of themselves. The truth of their lives was not just one of devotion, but of endurance under pressure. The convent was not always cruel, but it was rarely free. Within its walls, women navigated a world of contradictions, where sanctity and subjugation walked hand in hand, and silence, once chosen, could never be fully unchosen. Beneath the frescoed ceilings of medieval cathedrals and the lofty sermons of the pulpit, another story unfolded at ground level, one far removed from gold leaf icons and theological debate. It was the slow, constant story of hunger, not famine alone which arrived in waves, but the low hum of chronic undernourishment that shaped the lives of millions across the medieval world. In cities and villages, on mountain terraces and desert edges, the human body itself bore the cost of social hierarchy, environmental fragility, and policies designed to preserve wealth rather than distribute it. Bones bent under labor without sustenance, teeth rotted from early childhood, and stomachs adapted to long stretches of emptiness, as if this were a natural state. In Western Europe, the image of bread, crusty, warm, sustaining, dominates medieval imagination. But for many, it was little more than ground-up rye or barley, coarse and dark, often spoiled by ergot fungus or mixed with ground bark to stretch its supply. The rich ate fine wheat loaves. The poor made do with what they could salvage. In times of crop failure, which came often, entire regions resorted to boiling grass, chewing roots or grinding acorns into a bitter paste. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, triggered by torrential rains and a collapsed grain system, reduced much of northern Europe to starvation. Fields drowned, livestock perished, and trade routes ground to a halt. Reports from the Low Countries spoke of parents abandoning children. In parts of England and Germany, courts recorded accusations, whether real or imagined, of cannibalism. Yet famine was not unique to Europe, nor was it always caused by natural disaster. In the Delhi Sultanate of the 14th century, chroniclers documented market collapses and failed harvests, exacerbated by war and forced taxation. The weight of empire building fell heaviest on the poor, whose surplus grain was extracted to feed armies and construction projects, leaving local reserves perilously low. When drought struck, the margin for survival vanished. Even in years of relative calm, hunger remained an everyday companion. The Indian subcontinent had a long tradition of granary storage and irrigation, but political upheaval or corruption often diverted these systems to elite benefit, severing the lifeline for ordinary farmers. In sub-Saharan Africa, climatic variation created periods of abundance and scarcity alike. In the Sahel and along the Niger River, agriculture was delicate and seasonal. During lean years, desertification pushed communities to the brink, especially those already burdened by tribute systems imposed by larger kingdoms. Nomadic groups like the Tuareg adapted through mobility, but sedentary communities often found themselves at the mercy of local rulers who controlled water sources and granary access. Oral histories preserved in griot traditions speak not only of kings and battles, but of years of withered millet, failed yam harvests, and the quiet tragedies of hunger beneath the canopy of empire. In Japan, during the Heian and Kamakura periods, rice was currency as much as sustenance, a tax, a gift, a measure of wealth and class. Peasants, though responsible for its cultivation, often saw little of it on their own tables. Instead, they relied on foraged greens, fish bones and millet. When natural disasters struck, typhoons, earthquakes, locust swarms, the delicate balance of subsistence broke. Buddhist temples offered relief, but their aid came with expectations of service, prayer, or conversion. In the most extreme periods, desperate families sold their daughters to brothels or into indentured servitude simply to survive the winter. These were not choices, but bargains made under duress, the price of another day alive. Even in cities where trade routes should have promised variety and abundance, food security was far from stable. Medieval Cairo, one of the most sophisticated urban centers of its age, still experienced periods of famine when Nile floods failed, or when political conflict disrupted grain caravans. Chroniclers described the prices of flour soaring beyond the reach of common people, while the wealthy hoarded dates and spices behind locked compound gates. In Constantinople, markets were abundant in normal times, but imperial hoarding and merchant monopolies could quickly turn plenty into panic. The dark truth beneath the medieval feast is not the absence of food, but the ways in which it was withheld. Systems of taxation, hierarchy, religious obligation, and land ownership ensured that abundance flowed upward, while scarcity trickled downward. Charity was expected and often given, but it was not enough to offset the deep structures of inequality. Soup kitchens might feed a village for a day, a lord's banquet might feed his family for a week, but systemic hunger endured across generations. And so, while illuminated manuscripts sang of abundance and heavenly banquets, most medieval people learned to live with less than enough, not in a spirit of simple life, but in a condition of silent necessity. Hunger was not a brief visitor. It was a long, familiar shadow, walking beside them through the turning of every season. Amid the harsh rhythms of medieval life, illness arrived not as a rare calamity, but as an expected companion, a shadow that brushed every household, rich or poor, without discrimination. Yet the paths to healing were as unequal as the streets themselves. For all the prayers and herbal lore, for all the saints invoked and salves prepared, medieval medicine often bore little resemblance to care as we now understand it. It was shaped by limited knowledge, but also by belief systems that entwined the body with sin, the soul with sickness, and healing with punishment or purification. To fall ill in the Middle Ages was not merely a matter of biology, it was a reckoning with society's deepest fears. In towns across Europe, the sick were often feared more than pitied. Lepers, believed to carry a disease both physical and spiritual, were expelled from communities, sometimes made to wear bells around their necks to warn others of their approach. Special leper houses, little more than shacks on the outskirts, provided isolation more than aid. Some received alms or food, but others were left to die in quiet anonymity. The leper's body became a symbol of divine judgment, a walking reminder of impurity. The Church taught that sickness could be a test from God, or worse, a punishment for hidden sin. Confession and repentance were often prescribed alongside any physical remedy. And yet, some treatments were pursued with fervent energy. Barbers doubled as surgeons, bloodletting was common, and herbalists, many of them women, passed down recipes for healing, drawn from centuries of observation. Yarrow for wounds, fennel for digestion, willow bark for pain. But these were not always safe roles to inhabit. In Christian Europe, particularly during periods of social unrest, women who practiced healing outside official church sanction were increasingly seen as threats. The line between healer and heretic could blur quickly. Accusations of witchcraft sometimes sprang not from dark rituals, but from the simple act of easing a fever when no priest had been called. In the Islamic world, however, medicine developed along more systematic lines, drawing on Greek texts and expanding them with new discoveries. Physicians in places like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo established hospitals, bimaristans, that offered treatment regardless of religion or status. These centers employed physicians trained in humoral theory, but also skilled in surgery, pharmacology, and observation. Yet even here, access depended on proximity and privilege. A farmer in rural Anatolia or a herdsman in the Maghreb could not simply walk into a scholarly hospital. Most people still relied on local healers, traveling monks, or folk remedies. And when Islamic Spain fell to Christian forces during the Reconquista, many of these medical texts were lost, hidden, or condemned as suspect knowledge. In India, Ayurvedic practices flourished among both urban elites and rural populations, offering a system rooted in balance and elemental forces. Yet even this tradition, ancient and refined, could not prevent mass suffering during periodic outbreaks of disease. Epidemics swept through communities already weakened by famine or war. Access to trained healers was uneven, and caste divisions often limited who could treat whom. Some were permitted to touch the sick, others were forbidden even to enter their homes. Healing, like hunger, reflected the stratifications of the world around it. Throughout much of Africa, medicine was inseparable from spiritual belief. Herbalists, diviners, and ritual specialists worked within a framework that treated illness as a disruption in the harmony between person, ancestors, and land. In the Kingdom of Congo, healers known as Congo used plants, prayer, and spirit possession to address both physical and emotional wounds. Yet during periods of colonial contact and religious pressure from both Islamic and Christian sources, these traditions were increasingly driven underground or labeled as sorcery. Those who once held community respect risked denunciation, exile, or worse. Across Asia, similar tensions unfolded. In Japan, the blending of Chinese medicinal theory with native Kung-fu practices created a rich tradition of healing. But once again, access depended on class. The samurai and aristocratic classes employed trained physicians, while peasants relied on village knowledge and traveling monks. When epidemics swept through the islands, smallpox, influenza, or unknown fevers, those without means were left to their own devices. Some isolated themselves in mountain shrines, believing illness was the result of angry spirits. Others accepted suffering as part of karmic burden, seeking no cure at all. Even childbirth, the most common cause of death among young women, was perilous beyond modern imagination. Midwives assisted, but complications were frequent and fatal. A difficult birth could leave a woman to bleed out, convulse, or suffer for hours as her family waited outside, powerless. There were prayers for Saint Margaret, the protector of women in labor, and charms to be hung above the door. But there was rarely help that could truly change the outcome. The truth is, to be sick in the Middle Ages was not just to be unwell, it was to step outside the structure of daily life and into a liminal space,
a realm where suspicion, theology, and social standing determined your care. Healing was not always about getting better. Sometimes it was about being seen, forgiven, or simply endured.
Across the shimmering trade routes and dazzling courts of the medieval world, beneath the silks and spices, beneath the gold-laced manuscripts and sweeping dynasties, there ran a quieter infrastructure, one built not of stone or policy, but of people in bondage. The Middle Ages were an era not only of conquest and pilgrimage, but of captivity, of forced labor and silent servitude that shaped the prosperity of empires and kingdoms across continents. While the Atlantic slave trade would later eclipse earlier systems in scale and brutality, the roots of global human trafficking run deep into the medieval centuries, woven into the fabrics of daily life and imperial ambition. In the heart of the Islamic world, slavery was codified, regulated, and ever-present. From the markets of Damascus and Cairo to the ports of Zanzibar and Basra, enslaved people were bought and sold as laborers, concubines, soldiers, and servants. Unlike the rigid racial categorizations that would come in later centuries, medieval Islamic slavery was more varied in origin. Slavic captives from Eastern Europe, Turkic nomads taken from the steppes, East Africans from the Swahili coast, and even Central Asians and Greeks were all caught in the web of trade. The justifications were religious and legal. Non-Muslims could be enslaved if captured in war or bought from those who held them. Yet conversion to Islam, while sometimes offering a path to better treatment or freedom, did not always guarantee release. Some slaves rose to positions of influence, most famously the Mamluks, enslaved soldiers who were trained, converted, and eventually formed their own powerful ruling class in Egypt. But these were rare exceptions. For most, life remained defined by control and confinement. Women were often taken as concubines, their children sometimes accepted into households, sometimes sold. Young boys were particularly prized for their perceived malleability, trained as scribes, singers, or attendants, stripped of origin and folded into the machinery of elite service, their languages forgotten, their pasts unrecorded. In Christian Europe, slavery had taken on new forms. By the High Middle Ages, outright slavery had declined in many regions, replaced by serfdom, a system that bound peasants to the land, rendering them legally unfree even if not bought or sold. But the borders between these statuses were not always clear. In parts of Italy and Spain, especially in urban areas, household slavery persisted well into the 15th century. Girls as young as 10 were trafficked from the Balkans, sold into domestic service where their labor and bodies alike were considered property. Legal documents describe them not in terms of humanity, but as goods, appraised, inherited, traded, and across the Iberian Peninsula. During the centuries of Muslim-Christian conflict known as the Reconquista, the taking of captives was routine. Christian prisoners were marched to North Africa. Muslim prisoners were distributed among Christian lords. Ransoms were demanded, but when unpaid, the captive was absorbed into servitude. Families torn apart in a single battle might never see one another again. In the Indian Ocean world, slavery moved alongside trade like a current beneath the waves. Arab merchants trafficked human beings alongside ivory, frankincense, and cloth, creating a commercial network that stretched from the Swahili coast to Gujarat to Sumatra. In South Asia, while caste dictated much of social hierarchy, enslaved laborers were still widely used, often taken from tribal populations, war captives, or those too poor to pay their debts. They worked in salt pans, rice fields, royal courts, and domestic spaces, largely invisible to the chroniclers of their time. The laws might mention them briefly, if at all. Their voices are absent from the record,
but their presence was everywhere. In China during the Tang and Song dynasties, slavery existed as a domestic institution, typically confined to household service or punishment for crimes. Female slaves were common in elite homes, often taken from conquered regions or bought in urban markets. Some were trained in music and poetry to entertain guests. Others served behind closed doors. Male slaves might be sent to labor in salt mines or agricultural estates. Though the scale of slavery in China was not as massive as in other parts of the world, its function as a form of social control, especially during times of rebellion or war, was unmistakable. Whole populations could be enslaved after failed uprisings, their status passed on to their children. In West Africa, the trans-Saharan trade moved both gold and people northward. The Empire of Mali, celebrated for its learning and prosperity, relied in part on enslaved labor to build and sustain its grandeur. Enslaved scholars, craftspeople, and soldiers were part of court life, often taken from neighboring regions or as spoils of war. In forested kingdoms like Benin, captives were incorporated into rituals and used in agricultural labor. Slavery here was often hereditary, a fact that complicates romanticized views of pre-colonial African societies. These were complex civilizations, yes, but not without their own shadows. Even the sacred was not free of bondage. In parts of the Islamic world, WQF endowments, charitable religious institutions, owned slaves to manage land or maintain infrastructure. Christian monasteries too held serfs and laborers under conditions that mirrored slavery in all but name. These were systems maintained not only by kings and sultans, but by priests, abbots and judges. The sanctity of the building did not extend to the one sweeping its floors.
Beneath the thrones and temples of the medieval world lay another kind of architecture, one built not of stone and stained glass, but of laws etched in fear, customs enforced through silence, and punishments shaped more by spectacle than fairness. Justice, as it was practiced in many medieval societies, often had little to do with truth in any modern sense. It was a system not so much designed to protect the innocent as it was to preserve social order, uphold hierarchy, and reinforce power through ritualized control. Trials were held, yes, but they were often performative. Guilt and innocence did not always depend on evidence, but on standing, confession, or divine judgment. The courtroom was not a place of clarity, but of anxiety, and for many, the justice system was less a safeguard than a looming threat. In Christian Europe, one of the most striking features of medieval justice was the use of ordeal, an ancient practice that placed the outcome of a trial in the hands of God, interpreted through the physical body of the accused. If a man was accused of theft, he might be ordered to plunge his arm into boiling water and retrieve a stone from the bottom. If, after several days, the wound showed signs of healing, he was declared innocent. If it festered, the guilt was confirmed. Others might walk across red-hot plowshares, carry burning iron, or be thrown into rivers with their arms bound. If they floated, they were guilty, their buoyancy seen as rejection by the earth. If they sank, innocence was assumed, though often at the cost of life. The ordeal was not fringe or rare. It was embedded into legal codes, conducted in the presence of priests, and believed by many to be a true expression of divine will. It offered closure, if not fairness. And yet, beneath its theological justifications, it often mirrored the inequalities of society. Wealthy or well-connected defendants might be spared the ordeal entirely, allowed to swear oaths of innocence with character witnesses. The poor, the foreign, the marginalized. They walked barefoot across the flame, Even where formal ordeals were absent, cruelty remained. In feudal courts, especially among the manorial systems of Western Europe, justice was deeply local and often arbitrary. Lords or their appointed bailiffs acted as judges over the peasants who worked their land. Petty crimes, stealing a loaf of bread, gathering wood from the wrong forest, could result in public humiliation, flogging, or fines impossible to pay. There were no defense attorneys, no appeals. The social contract was clear: obedience in exchange for survival. In the Islamic world, legal systems were in some ways more structured, with courts governed by Sharia law, administered by qadis, judges trained in jurisprudence, and often respected as scholars. Yet even here, the application of justice could be inconsistent. Testimony was weighted by gender and religion. A Muslim man's statement carried more authority than a Christian's, and a woman's words were often valued at half that of a man's. In some cases, non-Muslims could not testify at all. Punishments, especially for theft, adultery, or apostasy, could be severe, including mutilation, lashing, or execution. Though in practice, such sentences were sometimes commuted or avoided through compensation. One of the more disturbing truths of medieval justice lies in its treatment of children. The modern notion of childhood as a protected category did not exist in most medieval societies. In many places, children as young as 7 could be held legally responsible for crimes. They were punished, imprisoned, or even executed under the same laws that governed adults. In England, records exist of 10-year-olds hanged for theft. In parts of Central Asia, young boys were imprisoned in chains to ensure their fathers paid taxes. And in the Catholic Church's inquisitorial process, children could be interrogated, even tortured, if suspected of heresy or sorcery. Torture itself was a widespread tool of investigation, rationalized as a means of extracting truth rather than inflicting suffering. The rack, the strappado, the thumbscrew, these were not instruments of myth or fiction. They were real and used across Europe in the name of law. Pain was believed to purify falsehood. Confession, even when wrung from the throat of the broken, was admissible and often decisive. But cruelty was not confined to the state. In the streets and village squares, justice could take on a mob-like quality. Accusations of witchcraft, adultery, or blasphemy could ignite public anger, leading to lynchings or shaming rituals. Stocks, pillories, public whippings, these were not simply punishments but performances meant to remind others of the costs of deviance. In some regions, the crowd was expected to participate, hurling insults or refuse. The spectacle was part of the sentence. Outside of Europe, justice systems bore different names but similar scars. In the Mongol Empire, Genghis Khan's law code, the Yorsa, enforced strict discipline across a vast and diverse population. Theft, desertion, or disobedience could bring swift and brutal penalties. In many African kingdoms, justice was mediated through elders or religious leaders, but could include ritual trials by ordeal or exile from the community. In the Aztec Empire, law was deeply codified, with severe punishments for even minor offenses, including execution for public drunkenness if the offender was of noble blood, a reminder that harshness extended to the elite as a performance of fairness. Among the countless graves scattered across the medieval world, most were never marked, never mourned in writing, never counted in the ledgers of kings or monks. These were the quiet burials of the nameless, the poor, the enslaved, the heretical, the foreign, the diseased, interred in haste or secrecy, in corners of fields, at the edges of town, or beneath the shadow of plague. The Middle Ages treated death with both reverence and dread, but the dignity of burial, like so much else, was unevenly distributed. While cathedrals housed the gilded tombs of bishops and royalty, layered in marble and Latin epitaphs, most of the dead simply vanished into the soil, and for some, even burial was denied. Mass graves were not uncommon. During waves of pestilence, particularly the Black Death, corpses were sometimes heaped together, wrapped only in their tattered garments, and covered in lime to hasten decomposition. Priests, overwhelmed by the scale of death, muttered abbreviated prayers or none at all. In Siena, bodies filled the churchyards until there was no space left between the tombstones. In Avignon, they were stacked in trenches by the thousands. Even in cities renowned for their art and learning, the scent of death filled the streets, and memory was triaged by necessity. Outside Christian Europe, similar scenes unfolded. In the Mongol Empire, nomadic communities had little tradition of monumental burial, and many of their dead were placed in unmarked ground or elevated platforms for exposure to the elements and scavenging animals, a practice both sacred and pragmatic. But during the empire's violent expansion, entire towns were depopulated in days. Chronicles mention cities where the bodies were so numerous that the living simply moved elsewhere, leaving the dead where they lay. Bones remained unburied, bleaching beneath the open sky, long after the conquerors had passed through. In India, certain deaths were ritualized in ways that now seem profoundly disturbing. The practice of saisi, where widows immolated themselves, willingly or under pressure on the funeral pyres of their husbands, was not universal, nor always coerced, but it was real. Described by both local sources and foreign observers, it was often framed as an act of devotion, a purification of the soul through flame. But for many women, particularly those from noble families, the pressures were enormous. Social shame, religious expectation, and even the threat of force made refusal nearly impossible. Some resisted and survived. Others were drugged, bound, or simply overpowered. Their deaths were praised in poetry and stone, but their pain went unwritten. There were other ways the dead were forgotten. In medieval Japan, the burial of those deemed hainin, outcasts, criminals or diseased, often occurred in remote locations without ceremony. These individuals were viewed as impure, their remains avoided even in death. The same was true in parts of medieval China, where criminals, rebels, or those who died by suicide could be denied proper burial rites, their souls believed to wander restlessly. Families fearing contamination or social disgrace sometimes refused to claim such bodies. Ghost festivals and exorcisms were conducted, not to honor these spirits, but to appease or banish them. In the Islamic world, burial was typically swift and uniform, within 24 hours facing Mecca, wrapped in plain cloth. It was a model of humility and equality in death. Yet during periods of conflict, such dignity could be interrupted. In the Crusades, the dead were often left to rot in the sun, their remains picked over by scavengers. Victors claimed the right to bury their own but neglected, or actively desecrated, the corpses of enemies. In cities like Jerusalem or Antioch, bones from fallen battles were later found piled in walls, burned in pits, or abandoned in the rubble of destroyed mosques and churches alike. In parts of West Africa, burial carried spiritual significance that went beyond the body. Ancestors were believed to influence the living, and improper burial risked unrest for generations. But even here, conquest and trade reshaped ritual. Slaves who died in transit, across desert routes or along riverbanks, were rarely buried according to their traditions. Their bodies were cast aside, their spirits stranded. Oral histories, passed down through generations, sometimes speak of places to avoid,
areas where the earth itself was said to grieve. These were landscapes of unacknowledged death, haunted not by ghosts in the Western sense, but by the weight of unresolved endings. The medieval mind did not ignore death. Far from it. It dwelled upon it constantly. Art, literature, and religion were saturated with skulls, hourglasses, and sermons, reminding listeners that life was fleeting, that death was the great equalizer. But this philosophy rarely extended to the treatment of the dead in practice. Inequality so present in life continued into death. Who was remembered, who was honored, and who was erased? These were decisions shaped by wealth, piety, and fear. Graveyards were often segregated, not just by class but by belief. Heretics were buried outside the walls. Jews, even when granted burial grounds, were sometimes exhumed and desecrated during pogroms. Muslims under Christian rule were denied cemeteries, while Christians under Muslim rule buried their dead in secret or under heavy surveillance. Even the earth, it seems, was divided.
The Middle Ages were not a time of religious uniformity, as often imagined, but rather a vast and shifting mosaic of creeds, sects, and spiritual systems, each with its own sacred truths, and each drawing invisible lines between those who belonged and those who did not. Beneath the hymns and holy texts, the incense and ritual, lay an ever-present tension, the fear of the outsider, the heretic, the unbeliever. In every corner of the medieval world, belief was not merely a private matter of the soul, it was a marker of safety, a form of legal protection, a shield against suspicion. To stray from the sanctioned path was to risk not just condemnation, but violence, exile, or death. In Latin Christendom, the Catholic Church exerted enormous influence over both the spiritual and political lives of its followers. Faith-shaped law determined the calendar and explained natural disasters, illness, and war. But orthodoxy was carefully guarded. Those who challenged the Church's authority, whether openly or by accident, were labeled heretics, a term broad enough to include mystics, reformers, and ordinary people who held the wrong opinion at the wrong time. The Cathars of southern France, for instance, believed in a dualist universe, one in which the material world was evil and spiritual purity could be achieved through radical simplicity. Their beliefs were not violent, but their refusal to accept church authority led to one of the most brutal crusades in medieval history. Entire towns were burned, thousands slaughtered. The Inquisition, born in the wake of this campaign, began as a tool for identifying and eliminating such spiritual threats, and its methods would grow increasingly sophisticated and cruel over the following centuries. The Inquisition's reach extended into every village and city. Informants were rewarded for reporting neighbors, confessions were extracted under torture, and trials were conducted with grim efficiency. Accused individuals might be held in secret for months, their charges undisclosed, their judges anonymous. Even if acquitted, the stain of suspicion often lingered, and once condemned, the punishments were severe: imprisonment, confiscation of property, forced penance, public flogging, and for the unrepentant, burning at the stake, a spectacle designed as both punishment and warning. Yet these structures of exclusion were not unique to Christian Europe. In the Islamic world, while the Ummah, the community of believers, was ideally inclusive, strict boundaries still defined acceptable belief. Philosophers like Al-Hallaj and Averroes, who delved into mysticism or rationalist interpretations of the Quran, were condemned for their writings. In Shia communities under Sunni rule, or vice versa, even minor theological disagreements could result in persecution. In the Abbasid Caliphate, the Mina, an inquisition of sorts in the 9th century, was imposed to enforce a specific view of the Quran as created rather than eternal. Scholars who resisted were imprisoned, beaten, or silenced. Though short-lived, the Mina set a precedent that orthodoxy could be enforced by the state, not just debated in the mosque. In South Asia, the religious landscape was even more intricate. A tapestry of Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and later Islam, interwoven with local cults and regional deities. Here too, boundaries were drawn, though less by formal doctrine and more through social codes. The caste system, deeply entangled with Hindu religious law, enforced spiritual hierarchy in tangible terms. Dalits, or so-called untouchables, were excluded from temples, forbidden from learning sacred texts, and in many cases denied the right to worship alongside others. Their very presence was viewed as a form of pollution, a spiritual danger reinforced through law and custom. Religious identity was not just about belief. It was about body, lineage, and visibility. Buddhism, often romanticized in modern times as inherently tolerant, was not immune to these dynamics. In parts of Japan and Tibet, sectarian rivalries turned violent. Monasteries feuded over doctrine, political influence, and resources, sometimes hiring mercenaries to enforce their claims. In China, during periods of dynastic transition or foreign rule, Buddhist institutions were targeted for their wealth and foreign origins. Temples were destroyed, monks forcibly laicized, scriptures burned. Religious purity became a proxy for political loyalty, a pattern echoed in many parts of the medieval world. For Jews living in both Christian and Muslim territories, the medieval centuries were marked by alternations between protection and persecution. In Andalusian Spain, under certain caliphs, Jewish scholars flourished, contributing to philosophy, medicine, and poetry. But such tolerance was fragile. Under more conservative regimes, Jews faced forced conversions, restrictions on dress, limitations on trade, and exclusion from public life. In Christian Europe, conditions were often worse. Accusations of well poisoning, ritual murder, or host desecration could spark violent pogroms, especially during times of crisis. Entire communities were expelled from England in 1290, from France in 1306, from various German cities throughout the 14th century. The dark truth in all of this is not simply that religious intolerance existed, but that it was often woven into the very structure of medieval society. It was not an aberration, but a feature, a means of defining who could be trusted, who could be punished, and who could be erased. Rituals of exclusion were often public, humiliating, and violent. A woman forced to recant her beliefs before a jeering crowd, a synagogue razed while the congregation fled, a man imprisoned for owning a forbidden book. Among the most shadowed figures of the medieval world were its children, not the idealized cherubs of illuminated manuscripts, but the real, breathing, growing young who labored, suffered, and disappeared behind the dominant stories of kings and clergy. In modern memory, childhood is a sanctuary, a protected span of years marked by learning, play, and care. But in the Middle Ages, childhood was fragile, fleeting, and often invisible. It was not only a time of vulnerability, but of function, where a child's worth was often measured in labor, obedience, or the alliances their bodies might forge. Their stories were rarely written. Their graves were often unmarked, yet they formed the silent majority of the medieval population. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. In many regions, more than a third of children died before the age of 5, succumbing to fevers, diarrhea, infections, or congenital conditions poorly understood and poorly treated. Midwives and healers did their best, but resources were few, and the causes of death were wrapped in mystery. The child who failed to cry at birth, the child whose head grew soft and bloated, the child who refused to suckle, These were seen not as medical cases but as omens, punishments, or signs of spiritual imbalance. Baptism in Christian Europe was often rushed within hours of birth, for fear the baby would die unshriven. In many parts of the Islamic world, Aqiqah rituals involved both celebration and sacrifice, balancing joy with the sobering knowledge that life was far from guaranteed. But those who survived infancy quickly stepped into a world of expectation. By the age of 7, children in many cultures were considered capable of responsibility, of tending animals, gathering firewood, fetching water, watching siblings. In peasant households, work and family life were inseparable. The line between play and labor was thin, if it existed at all. In urban areas, children were apprenticed early. A boy might be sent to a blacksmith's forge, a girl to a weaver's bench, both subject to the demands of adults who might be kind, indifferent, or cruel. Discipline was often physical, and silence was often required. Crying too much, asking too many questions, or faltering at one's task could provoke the rod, the belt, the slap. Such punishments were not viewed as abuse. They were considered instruction. In elite families, childhood had a different, but no less complicated face. Noble boys were raised with the burden of future command, often sent away from home to train in the households of higher lords. There, they served as pages or squires, learning manners, warfare, and the art of survival among strangers. Their emotional lives were largely unrecorded, but the structure of their upbringing suggests a system as rigid as any monastery. For noble girls, the situation could be even more constrained. Betrothals were often arranged in infancy. Their bodies became tools of alliance, their fates determined by fathers, bishops, and contracts, sealed before they could read or write their own names. In the courts of China, child emperors sat on thrones they barely understood, surrounded by eunuchs and regents who wielded real power. In South Asia, children of certain castes were tied to temples, made to serve in religious roles that blurred the lines between worship and exploitation. In the Devadasi tradition, girls were dedicated to deities, taught to dance, and often subjected to sexual service under the guise of ritual obligation. Their lives were ornamented, but not free. Their childhoods were ceremonial, but not innocent. For children born into slavery, childhood was almost indistinguishable from adulthood. From the moment they could carry a load or follow a command, they worked in kitchens, fields, and households. They were bought, sold, disciplined, and sometimes branded. Some were taken as companions for elite children, but companionship did not mean equality. Others were raised for specific purposes: eunuchs in imperial courts, dancers for aristocratic gatherings, or runners trained for distance communication. Their origins, names, and dreams were often stripped from the record, their stories only hinted at in inventories or bills of sale. Even religion could not shield children from darkness. In Christian Europe, Jewish children were occasionally the targets of horrific rumors, accused of being stolen or murdered in false stories known as blood libels, which triggered massacres of entire communities. In times of plague or drought, children were sometimes thought to be harbingers of sin. Deformed births could provoke accusations of witchcraft. In certain rural areas, children born out of wedlock or under suspicious omens were left exposed, abandoned in forests, ditches, or church steps, their survival left to fate or passing strangers. The tragedy lies in how little of them remains. Their voices were soft, their paper rare, their words often never written at all. And so the darkness of medieval childhood is not only in what they suffered, but in how easily they were forgotten. The unnamed, the unpictured, the unseen. They lived in the shadows of towers and temples, and when they were gone, the silence returned. Amid the long shadows of medieval life, where hunger, silence, and fear often shaped the rhythms of the day, laughter may seem an unlikely presence. And yet, it was there, crude, biting, public, and often dangerous. Humor in the Middle Ages was not merely entertainment. It was a form of control, a tool of power, and sometimes a means of survival. It flowed through carnivals, mystery plays, court jesters, and marketplace insults, but always within limits drawn by class and authority. To laugh was human, but to laugh at the wrong person in the wrong place could carry a terrible cost. In the great halls of nobility, jesters, sometimes called fools or clowns, were given unusual license. Dressed in patchwork clothes with bells on their caps, they performed songs, acrobatics, satire, and mimicry. They mocked their lords to their faces, pointed out hypocrisy, and spoke truths others dared not say. But this freedom was not protection. Many were enslaved, mentally disabled, or physically deformed individuals chosen specifically for the role. Their performances a daily sacrifice of dignity for the amusement of those in power. A jester's favor could rise and fall in moments. One misplaced joke, one too clever truth, and the entertainer might vanish from court altogether, dismissed, imprisoned, or worse. In village life, laughter took the shape of ritual humiliation. The medieval carnival, especially in Christian Europe, served as a brief reversal of order, where peasants played at kingship, women mocked men, and fools were crowned in parody of bishops. Yet these inversions were carefully scripted. The church allowed them not because it tolerated disorder, but because they diffused it. By permitting a moment of mock rebellion, the real hierarchies were ultimately reinforced. And when the festival ended, the masks came off, and the existing order returned with more weight than before. Those who failed to keep their jesting within bounds could face fines, floggings, or time in the stocks. Satire in literature and song carried its own dangers. Troubadours and poets who criticized churchmen, nobles, or even fellow artists sometimes found themselves exiled or silenced. In Al-Andalus, Jewish and Muslim poets composed verses filled with biting wit and social commentary, but their success depended on patronage. A fallen patron meant not just loss of income, but the withdrawal of protection. In parts of medieval China, scholars who penned clever but critical couplets about court corruption could find themselves demoted, imprisoned, or exiled to distant provinces. Humor, even veiled in metaphor, was not always safe. Women in particular faced sharp boundaries around public speech. While men might jest in the tavern or at court, women who laughed too loudly, mocked too freely, or wielded wit in debate risked being labeled as unruly, or worse, as witches. A sharp tongue could be seen as a sign of spiritual danger. In England and Scotland, the scold's bridle, a metal contraption fitted over the head with a gag for the tongue, was used to punish women accused of gossip, mockery, or unwomanly speech. These were not mythical instruments. They were real tools of humiliation, fastened in public squares to the jeers of gathered crowds. Even plays, one of the era's most popular forms of communal amusement, were watched with suspicion. Church-sanctioned dramas often reinforced moral messages, with devils and fools serving as warnings against sin. But secular plays that mocked the clergy or aristocracy were suppressed. In 13th century Paris, performance troupes had to register their scripts with local authorities. In Florence, playwrights who mocked city officials were fined or forbidden from staging future work. Humor was permitted so long as it entertained without threatening the status quo. And yet, laughter also served as a refuge. In the ghettos and quarters of Europe and the Islamic world, Jewish communities cultivated a tradition of sharp,
ironic storytelling that poked fun at suffering itself, a kind of defiance wrapped in wit. In African courts, griots told tales that gently mocked kings to remind them of their humanity. In Japanese villages, folk festivals included masked dances that lampooned the upper classes, offering catharsis, if not true rebellion. But always the cost lingered beneath the surface. Laughter could invite punishment, joy could be surveilled, and humor, though powerful, was not free. The medieval world was crisscrossed by paths, roads etched by hooves, sandals, and wagon wheels, stretching across continents in search of something: salvation, profit, refuge, or redemption. But not all who traveled did so willingly. For many, the road was not an escape, but a sentence, imposed by law, conflict, or desperation. Beneath the celebrated stories of pilgrims and merchants lies a quieter current of exile, expulsion, and wandering without welcome. Journeys not of adventure, but of exclusion. In medieval Europe, exile was a common punishment imposed on thieves, heretics, adulterers, or even debtors. To be exiled meant more than leaving a town. It meant losing your identity, your family, your community, your rights to land or labor. In many cities, a branded mark was burned into the skin of the exiled so they could be recognized and rejected wherever they went. Some were warned with documents, others were escorted beyond the gates at sword point. For most, exile was effectively a slow death sentence, without the networks of trust and patronage that defined medieval life. The wandering outcast often had no means to survive. Expulsion also came at the hands of fear. During times of plague, towns shut their gates to outsiders, turning travelers into suspects. Vagabonds, a term that grew increasingly criminal in legal codes, were blamed for theft, disease, and unrest. In 14th century England, the Ordinance of Labourers forbade able-bodied people from travelling without work, associating movement with laziness and moral failure. Laws required anyone without employment to settle or face arrest, but for many displaced by war or famine, movement was not a choice. It was the only option left. Religious minorities, especially Jews, were among the most targeted. Entire communities were repeatedly expelled across Europe, from England in 1290, France in waves throughout the 14th century, Spain and Portugal at the end of the 15th. These expulsions were often abrupt, brutally enforced, and economically devastating. Jewish families were given days or weeks to sell their property, convert, or leave. Many fled with only what they could carry. Children were sometimes taken by force and baptized against their parents' wishes. On the road, they faced robbery, hunger, and cold, moving from one uncertain refuge to the next. Muslims too were displaced, especially as Christian forces reclaimed the Iberian Peninsula during the Reconquista. Even after formal surrender treaties, forced conversions and expulsions followed. The Moriscos, Muslims who had converted to Christianity, often under duress, were subject to scrutiny and periodic exile for generations. Their language was banned, their customs outlawed. In time, many fled or were driven from their ancestral homes, dissolving into refugee populations scattered across North Africa or the Ottoman Empire. Far to the east, exile took different forms. In medieval China, banishment was used not only as punishment, but as a political tool. Scholars, poets, and officials who fell out of favor were sent to distant provinces, cut off from their networks, and forced into quiet survival. Some continued to write in exile, their works marked by sorrow, loneliness, and a deep sense of loss. Others vanished from the record entirely. In Russia and Central Asia, exile often came through conquest. As the Mongol Empire expanded, entire populations were relocated. Not just warriors, but farmers, artisans, and administrators, uprooted and resettled to serve imperial needs. This form of exile blurred the lines between captivity and colonization, erasing local cultures and replacing them with systems designed to maintain order and tribute. Women, too, were exiled, not always across borders, but from homes, villages, and families. A woman accused of adultery might be cast out with no legal recourse. Widows without protection were sometimes driven away, viewed as economic burdens or social threats. Even nuns who violated monastic codes could be transferred to distant convents, isolated and silenced. The idea of home in the Middle Ages was not simply a dwelling, but a web of relationships, responsibilities, and recognition. To be exiled was to be cut from that web. Roads were often unmarked, unsafe, and hostile. Travelers could be attacked by bandits, denied shelter by suspicious villagers, or accused of sorcery or spying. Many changed their names. Others posed as pilgrims or laborers just to pass unnoticed. Some never stopped moving, and yet along these roads, small networks of care sometimes emerged. Travelers' inns run by religious orders offered bread and shelter. Underground communities of migrants provided secret aid. Exiled poets passed letters and verses through distant kin. The road, though perilous, became a thread connecting the forgotten, a place where silence met silence, and survival was stitched together from moments of fleeting kindness.
It is easy to imagine medieval law as a matter of kings and courts, of codices and decrees, handed down from high places and carried out in stone halls. But much of justice in the Middle Ages occurred not in public view, but in shadows, in secret gatherings, whispered accusations, and veiled rituals designed more to terrify than to rehabilitate. At the crossroads of superstition, fear, and power emerged a world of masked enforcers, silent punishments, and invisible rules. The law was not always a system. Sometimes it was a performance. And behind that performance stood a deeply unsettling truth. Not all punishment came from the state. In many regions of Europe, extrajudicial justice flourished under cover of tradition. Rural communities often relied on vigilante customs to punish what they saw as social deviance. In parts of France and the Low Countries, groups known as chivalries would gather to mock and shame individuals who had violated local expectations. A man who beat his wife, a widow who remarried too quickly, a couple whose union was seen as improper. These processions were often theatrical and cruel. Effigies were paraded, horns were blown through the night, and the accused might be forced to ride backward on a donkey through the village while being pelted with refuse. What made these rituals particularly disturbing was their legality, or lack thereof. They operated outside formal courts, enforced by community consensus rather than written codes. And yet, local authorities often turned a blind eye or even participated. The idea was not to administer justice, but to restore order through spectacle. It was a reminder the village watched, the village remembered, and the village punished. Elsewhere, secret brotherhoods took justice into their own hands. In 14th century Germany, a clandestine group known as the Vimic courts operated across Westphalia. Their members, often masked and robed, claimed to enforce imperial law where official courts failed. They conducted trials in forests or hidden chambers, issued death sentences by majority vote, and posted warnings or execution notices on trees and doorways. Accused individuals sometimes never knew the charges against them until the rope was around their neck. The Vim thrived on fear, and even emperors hesitated to challenge them directly. In Mediterranean port cities, organized crime was often indistinguishable from civic authority. Smugglers, pirates, and protection rackets operated under the surface of legal trade. Merchants who refused to pay bribes might find their ships delayed, their goods accidentally lost, Witnesses rarely came forward. In Venice and Genoa, where commercial networks reached across oceans, justice could be purchased or quietly avoided. A man could vanish without explanation, and the official records would say nothing. The Catholic Church, too, wielded a quiet power beneath its public rituals. Canon law offered a parallel justice system that operated alongside, and sometimes above, secular courts. But in remote monasteries or bishoprics, ecclesiastical punishment could be deeply secretive. A monk who violated his vows might be confined to solitary prayer for months, fed only bread and water, forbidden from speaking. A cleric suspected of impropriety could be transferred quietly, rather than tried. Accusations of abuse, especially against women or lower clergy, were often buried beneath layers of protocol and silence. In parts of the Islamic world, similar shadow systems existed. Tribal councils and elder gatherings, while rooted in tradition and often wise, could also enforce harsh punishments without recourse to formal appeal. A family dishonored by rumor, whether true or not, might respond with banishment, beatings, or forced marriage. In urban centers, powerful guilds and merchant associations developed internal codes of justice, handling theft, dishonesty, or betrayal without involving the state. Sometimes these decisions were fair, other times they were brutal, and in households, the smallest courts of all, justice was deeply unequal. A noble might punish a servant with beatings or imprisonment for perceived disobedience. A master could order the mutilation of a slave without consequence. Even within peasant homes, patriarchs often held undisputed authority. The law might offer theoretical protection to women, children, and dependents, but in practice, enforcement was rare and testimony hard to prove. What happened behind closed doors remained there. Masks were not only literal, but symbolic. In many cases, punishers disguised themselves not with cloth, but with anonymity, hiding behind tradition, behind custom, behind the authority of how it has always been. The person shamed in a charivari did not know who organized it. The monk confined to silence could not name his accuser. The servant lashed in the yard saw no justice, only repetition. What binds these scenes together is their performance of power, a power that thrives not on fairness, but on fear. The quiet threat that justice might come, not from a court, but from the village, the guild, the family. That punishment might wear a smile, a mask, a robe, or simply pass unspoken in the night. The grandeur of medieval knowledge is often imagined in illuminated pages, gold-trimmed manuscripts, careful calligraphy, and the steady hands of scribes working by candlelight in monastery scriptoria or royal archives. These were the symbols of civilization, of learning, of divine truth passed down through ink and vellum. But behind this image of quiet scholarship lies a darker reality, a world where knowledge was hoarded, restricted, and shaped to serve those in power. The Middle Ages preserved much, but they also buried, censored, and lost more than we often realize. Literacy was the first barrier. In most parts of the medieval world, the ability to read and write was limited to a tiny minority: clergy, aristocrats, and a few urban merchants. Even within these ranks, full access to texts was rare. Books were expensive, time-consuming to produce, and usually chained within libraries to prevent theft. A single manuscript could take months to copy, using parchment made from the skins of dozens of animals. Owning a book was a mark of great privilege, and often one did not own the book so much as borrow it under heavy supervision. For the vast majority of people, knowledge came through memory, oral tradition, or controlled instruction. In Christian Europe, the Church was the principal guardian of written knowledge. Monasteries and cathedral schools preserved the works of the Church Fathers, Latin grammars, scripture commentaries, and selected classical texts. But not all knowledge was welcomed. Texts deemed heretical, suspicious, or simply too pagan were often destroyed or hidden. Entire libraries of Greek and Roman philosophy, science and medicine were lost not through deliberate malice alone, but through slow neglect, copied less frequently, stored less securely, or judged irrelevant to the salvation of the soul. Women were largely excluded from formal education. While some noble women learned to read for prayer or correspondence, few had access to scholarly texts. Convents occasionally served as centers of learning, but even there, knowledge was tightly controlled. A woman who sought to write beyond accepted themes, mysticism, virtue, or devotion, risked censure or invisibility. Some did it anyway, like Hildegard of Bingen or Christine de Pizan, but they were exceptions. Countless others went unrecorded, their ideas spoken in quiet rooms or lost altogether. In the Islamic world, learning flourished in different forms. Libraries in Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo housed vast collections of texts on astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and philosophy. Scholars translated Greek works into Arabic, adding commentaries that advanced understanding in fields from optics to anatomy. Yet even here, access was limited. Religious scholars, known as ulama, often controlled which texts were deemed appropriate. Sufi mystics, philosophers like Avicenna, or poets who explored controversial themes could find their work banned or attacked. As political regimes shifted, entire schools of thought were condemned. Libraries were burned during invasions or civil wars, some by crusaders, others by rival Muslim factions. In South Asia, oral knowledge reigned. Vedic texts, legal treatises, and epic poems were memorized and recited by Brahmins, passed down through centuries of disciplined training. But caste governed who could hear or recite these words. Lower castes were forbidden from studying sacred texts. In some regions, merely hearing the Vedas as an untouchable was considered a punishable offense. Knowledge was power, and power protected itself. China offered another model, with the imperial examination system serving as a pathway to bureaucratic status. But the system itself filtered knowledge. Confucian texts were central, while dissenting philosophies were marginalized. Dynastic shifts led to purges of certain works. During the Song dynasty, Neo-Confucian orthodoxy tightened control over education, redefining which texts were canonical and which were dangerous. Books were burned not for their lies, but for their challenges to the prevailing social order. The loss of knowledge in the medieval world was not always dramatic. Sometimes it was a quiet forgetting, a manuscript left untranscribed, a language no longer taught, a story told only once, then lost to time. Travelers' tales, women's songs, healers' lore, these formed a body of knowledge outside the written canon, vast but fragile. When those who held it died, the knowledge often died with them, and there were darker forces at work too. Inquisition records from across Europe show books confiscated and burned, sometimes with their owners. Arabic texts in medicine or astronomy were deemed suspicious by Christian authorities. Jewish writings were periodically destroyed in public rituals of erasure. In 1242, thousands of volumes of the Talmud were burned in Paris under royal decree, the culmination of a campaign by Dominican inquisitors who sought to eliminate what they considered blasphemous learning. In this lies a quiet truth, that knowledge in the Middle Ages was never neutral. It was guarded, manipulated, and at times deliberately destroyed. And those who lived beneath its shadow, the illiterate, the unlettered, the silenced, carried wisdom in other forms that rarely found their way to parchment,
but shaped the world all the same.
Beneath the sweeping robes of saints and the stony gaze of icons, medieval spirituality glowed with quiet intensity, but it also burned. For many, faith was not a gentle comfort, but a force that demanded suffering, sacrifice, and sometimes self-annihilation. The Middle Ages were an age of belief, but also of fear. Fear of hell, of sin, of invisible devils that prowled the soul and whispered in the silence between prayers. Salvation was promised, but always just out of reach. And the path to it was often paved with fire, flagellation, and the slow erosion of the body. In monastic cells across Europe and the Near East, men and women devoted themselves to asceticism, the deliberate denial of pleasure, comfort, and even health, in order to purify the soul. The concept of mortificatio, or putting to death the desires of the flesh, shaped how countless religious figures lived. Food was rationed to the edge of starvation. Sleep was broken by midnight prayers and stone floors. The body was treated not as a vessel, but as an obstacle, a thing to be punished, humiliated, and transcended. Some saints wore hair shirts infested with lice. Others whipped themselves until the floor was slick with blood, seeing in their pain a reflection of Christ's own suffering. Female mystics especially often directed their devotion inward, their bodies becoming both temple and battleground. In the writings of Catherine of Siena, for example, we read of prolonged fasting so severe that she reportedly consumed nothing but the Eucharist for long periods. Angela of Foligno described visions received during violent illness, convinced that physical agony opened the soul to divine truth. These women were often revered in their own time, yet their devotion was shaped by a world that offered few other avenues for expression, and where extreme bodily discipline was one of the few ways a woman might be heard. The boundaries between spiritual fervor and mental distress were thin. What today might be diagnosed as anorexia, obsessive-compulsive behavior, or psychosis was in many cases interpreted as holiness. And for those who did not conform to these models of piety, for the doubters, the depressed, the angry, there was no gentle counsel. They were told to confess more, fast harder, pray longer. If suffering continued, it was assumed to be a sign of sin. Demons, too, were believed to be everywhere. Not metaphorical demons, real ones. Theologians debated their origins and hierarchies. Manuals were written for identifying demonic possession, with instructions on how to interrogate and expel them. Sickness, misfortune, or unexplainable behavior could all be signs of spiritual attack. People whispered about devils hiding in wells, lurking in forests, or slipping into bedchambers under cover of night. And once accused of inviting such forces through a curse, a look, or a misunderstood word, there was little a person could do to prove otherwise. Exorcisms were not always dramatic rituals with crosses and shouting. Sometimes they were quiet, drawn-out affairs that involved isolation, beatings, or forced fasting. In monasteries, a troubled novice might be chained in his cell, fed scraps, and subjected to constant prayers until the demons were believed to have fled. Women thought to be possessed could be handed over to the care of male clerics, their bodies examined, restrained, or scoured for signs of spiritual corruption. But perhaps most haunting were the voluntary martyrs, those who sought suffering not out of compulsion, but as a form of ultimate devotion. In both Christian and Islamic contexts, stories were preserved of individuals who deliberately sought death in order to prove their faith. In early medieval Europe, accounts circulated of white martyrs who exiled themselves to desolate islands, hoping to find God in solitude and starvation. In later centuries, some would actively provoke pagan or rival rulers in hopes of being executed. These were rare, but not unheard of.
and the writings they left behind helped reinforce the idea that pain could be holy. In the Islamic world, Sufi mystics often practiced self-denial and ecstatic ritual as a means of union with the divine, while many orders focused on music, poetry, and contemplation. Others embraced practices that pushed the body toward transcendence, vigils without sleep, chants repeated until collapse, isolation in deserts or caves. Mainstream clerics sometimes condemned these acts as dangerous or heretical, yet they persisted, driven by visions and dreams that spoke more clearly than sermons. And in the midst of all this suffering, institutions prospered. Monasteries gained wealth through donations from nobles seeking prayers for their souls. Shrines attracted pilgrims who believed the relics of saints could heal disease or forgive sins. The more miraculous the story, especially if it involved blood, flame, or suffering, the greater the crowds. Faith in this world was not measured by peace of mind, but by visible transformation. The more the body bent, the more the soul was believed to rise. Yet faith was not always so grim. There were also hymns sung at dawn, candles lit in quiet devotion, and the deep comfort of ritual in a world of uncertainty. People found meaning in liturgies, in chants that echoed through stone halls, in prayers whispered beside the bed of the dying. But alongside these moments ran another current, a darker one, in which salvation was something to be earned through pain, and in which the human body was a battlefield upon which eternity was wagered.
Across the fields and forests of the medieval world, land was more than geography, it was fate. For most people, especially in rural Europe, life was defined by access to the soil beneath their feet. But that soil was rarely theirs to claim. It belonged to someone else. A nobleman, a monastery, a king, or a lord whose authority stretched from parchment charters down into the grooves of the plough. Feudalism, often described as a reciprocal system of loyalty and protection, was in truth far more rigid, more exploitative, and more punishing than modern imagination allows. It was not merely about duty, it was about control. The peasantry made up the overwhelming majority of the population, and yet they lived with the fewest rights. Many were serfs, legally bound to the land they worked, unable to move or marry without their lord's permission. They owed not only labor, but payments in kind, a portion of their grain, a share of their livestock, days spent repairing roads or tending the lord's fields. These obligations, known as corvées, were not voluntary, and they could expand unpredictably. If the lord needed more was taken. Resistance brought fines, beatings, or worse. Even those considered free peasants were often little better off. They paid rent, tolls, and tithes to overlapping authorities, the secular lord, the church, the local miller, each right to graze sheep, to gather firewood, to fish, came with a price. A man might have to pay to use the only bridge across the river, to grind his grain at the only licensed mill, to collect timber from a forest that his ancestors had once freely roamed. These rights were enforced by manorial courts, presided over by local lords or their stewards, where the rules were written in Latin and the accused spoke only the dialect of their village. Landlords held vast power not just over the economy, but over bodies. A widow could be forced to remarry within the manor to ensure her land stayed under local control. A daughter could be promised in marriage as part of a debt settlement. In some places, particularly in frontier regions, lords exercised banal rights, the ability to levy private taxes, enforce punishments, and claim services that went far beyond agriculture. There were whispered claims, too, of droit du seigneur, the supposed right of lords to claim sexual access to peasant brides on their wedding night. While historians debate the literal truth of this practice, its presence in folklore and complaint literature suggests that many believed it to be real or feared it enough to shape behavior. Outside Europe, similar systems took different forms. In Japan, the feudal structure that emerged under the shogunate created a tightly stratified society, with peasants obliged to supply rice, the base of both economy and survival, to their samurai overlords. Taxes were collected not in coins but in grain, and non-payment could mean confiscation or forced labor. Villagers built and maintained roads, irrigation systems, and even castles, all while being watched by traveling inspectors sent from provincial capitals. The burden of production fell on their shoulders. The benefits flowed upward. In the Islamic world, landholding often followed a different model. Large estates known as outcasts were granted to military officers or administrators in exchange for service. These lords collected taxes directly from the peasants and used the revenue to support their troops. While this system avoided some of the rigid inheritance laws of feudal Europe, it still placed enormous strain on the rural poor, who were squeezed for revenue by officials whose tenure was often short and motivated by personal gain. Complaints of extortion, violence, and seizure of crops appear in Arabic legal texts and chronicles throughout the Abbasid and Mamluk periods. In China, under the Song and Ming dynasties, land was technically imperial property, but in practice, it was dominated by wealthy gentry families who owned vast estates. Tenant farmers worked small plots and were subjected to rents and taxes that left them with little more than subsistence. During times of famine or flood, landlords rarely extended credit or forgiveness. Instead, desperate farmers might be forced to sell a child, mortgage future harvests, or flee entirely, joining the swelling ranks of landless laborers or rebels. Landlords in Africa, particularly in regions governed by kingdoms like Mali or Benin, often derived their power from lineage and divine association. The king, or Oba, claimed not only political authority, but spiritual stewardship over the land. Chiefs and elders under him redistributed fields according to custom, but this process could become coercive, especially as kingdoms expanded and absorbed new territories. Tribute systems required villages to provide not only food but labor, goods, and sometimes captives, tying land to a broader network of obligations. And still, across these varied systems, the pattern held: those who worked the land were rarely those who owned it. Their survival depended on weather, on good fortune, and on the whims of men they rarely met in person. When crops failed, debts grew. When children died, taxes remained. A poor harvest could mean the loss of next year's seed. A single missed payment could result in eviction, confiscation, or worse. The land was the cradle of medieval life, and the cage. It fed, it tethered, and it punished. And behind every sheaf of grain or thatched roof lay a structure of control that rendered freedom not just rare, but almost unimaginable. When the sun dipped below the horizon in the medieval world, a different kind of order emerged. One ruled not by lords or kings, but by fear, rumor, and the flickering light of a torch carried down an empty street. Darkness was more than absence. It was a presence in itself, thick with uncertainty and threat. Without artificial lighting, the night was not an extension of the day, but a liminal zone, a time when boundaries shifted and ordinary rules often dissolved. In that dimness, every sound carried weight, every shadow became suspect, and the social order braced itself against what might awaken after dusk. The rhythms of life shifted dramatically once night fell. In most medieval towns, a curfew bell rang to signal the closing of gates and the beginning of enforced quiet. Travelers were expected to find shelter, Shopkeepers barred their doors, and taverns slowly emptied of all but the boldest patrons. The streets were left to watchmen, men tasked with enforcing curfews, extinguishing unauthorized fires, and keeping order. But these watchmen were rarely professionals. Often unpaid or poorly trained, they patrolled with cudgels and lanterns, more symbolic than effective. Their warnings were shouted into the dark, and their presence offered little true protection. For many, night was when crimes unfolded with least consequence. Theft, assault, and illicit meetings thrived in the cover of darkness. Alleyways became traps, and even in more populated districts, cries for help might go unanswered. Women in particular were vulnerable after sundown, and many towns had laws prohibiting them from walking alone at night. If they were found doing so, suspicion followed of immorality, witchcraft, or disorderly behavior. The assumption was that respectable women had no business in the streets after dark. And yet, night was also a necessity. For the urban poor, especially those who lived in crowded tenements or worked long hours, the coolness of night offered brief respite. Street vendors finished preparations for the next morning. Midwives made late calls through winding lanes. Fishermen returned long before dawn. In cities near coastlines or rivers, smuggling and black market deals often took place under cover of night, lit by moonlight and muffled voices. Some watchmen, bribed or sympathetic, turned blind eyes to the transactions unfolding in quiet corners. In the countryside, night was ruled by older fears of spirits, wolves, and wandering souls. Fires were kept burning in hearths, not only for warmth, but for protection. Folklore brimmed with tales of nocturnal dangers, witches who traveled in the form of owls, spectral hunts that thundered across the sky, and unbaptized children, doomed to cry forever at the forest edge. These beliefs were not marginal. They shaped behavior. Travelers avoided certain paths. Mothers whispered protective prayers over sleeping infants, and entire communities planned their routines around the imagined dangers that waited beyond the lamplight. Some fears, though, were all too real. In plague-stricken cities, night brought the removal of bodies, carts rolling quietly through back streets, collecting the dead before the next day's toll began. In times of war or civil unrest, raids and assassinations were often timed to the darkest hours, when the guard was lightest and panic could spread quickly. Monasteries and castles, for all their thick walls, still posted sentries at night, not only against enemies, but against fire, the great unseen destroyer that could consume entire towns before a bell could sound the alarm. And amid all of this was the church, which did not sleep. The divine office, or liturgy of the hours, called monks to rise in the night for prayer. Matins, lauds, punctuating the darkness with hymns and readings. For the devout, these hours were sacred, moments when the veil between the earthly and the eternal thinned. But for most, the middle of the night was not a time of reflection. It was a time to endure. In some cities, night brought the sound of bells, not just for curfew, but for warning. Bells rang to signal a fire, a death, or an invasion. In other places, horns or drums replaced bells, marking the hours or calling watchmen to their posts. The sounds of night were sparse but meaningful. A dog barking, a baby crying, footsteps too fast or too hesitant. In the absence of light, sound became the map by which people navigated their fear. And yet, the night also held brief comforts. In rural villages, neighbors might gather quietly to share warmth and news before the fire. Stories passed between generations in whispered tones. Lovers met in hidden corners, their secrets protected by the dark. Dreams unfolded behind shuttered windows, weaving together fragments of hope,
memory, and dread. The night was not only a time of threat, it was a canvas for the unknown, where both danger and longing coexisted in uneasy balance. But always, there was the sense that night belonged to something else, to forces beyond control, to figures unseen, to powers unchallenged by law or daylight. And so the people of the Middle Ages moved cautiously after sunset, one step at a time, always listening, always watching, always wary of what the darkness might bring.
To walk across a medieval map was not to traverse continents, but to enter a worldview, one crowded with monsters, bordered by myth, and often more invested in symbolism than scale. The maps produced during the Middle Ages were not tools of direction, but declarations of belief. They told people where they stood in the universe, who ruled the edges of creation, and what to fear beyond the boundaries of known terrain. But these maps, beautiful and strange as they were, also served another purpose. They obscured, they distorted, and they told dangerous untruths about distant peoples and lands. Untruths that shaped prejudice, justified conquest, and buried entire civilizations beneath lines of ink. The most iconic of these is the Mappa Mundi, a circular representation of the world with Jerusalem at its center and the East, the direction of paradise and resurrection, placed at the top. These maps were theological first, geographical second. Africa was often compressed, distorted, or filled with wild beasts and desert. Asia stretched beyond recognition. The southern hemisphere barely existed at all, if it was acknowledged. At the edges, one found cynocephaly, dog-headed men, or blemmie, headless beings with faces in their chests. These were not idle fantasies. They reflected real medieval beliefs about foreignness, that people beyond the known world were not only different, but subhuman, monstrous, or cursed. These distortions were not accidental. They reinforced a worldview in which Europe, and particularly Christendom, sat at the moral and intellectual center of the universe. Lands inhabited by Muslims, Jews, Hindus, or others were marked not only by different colors or names, but by warnings. Cartographers, many of them clerics, filled blank spaces with Latin inscriptions describing sin, idol worship, or unnatural customs. The map became a tool of containment, a way to explain difference without needing to understand it. Travelers' tales only deepened the illusion. The stories of Marco Polo, Ibn Battuta, and John Mandeville circulated widely, mixing observation with exaggeration, hearsay with invention. Polo wrote of kingdoms ruled by cannibals and unicorns. Mandeville claimed to have seen lands where people ate only scented vapors. These accounts were copied, translated, and read aloud in courts and taverns, shaping medieval imaginations for generations. They made the world seem vast, but also conquerable, filled with wonders. Yes, but also with people who could be judged, ruled, or saved. The harm of these misconceptions became clearest in their political consequences. Crusaders marched not only to reclaim holy places, but to confront the imagined savagery described in maps and tales. In the Baltic region, Christian orders waged campaigns against pagans, whom they portrayed as less than human, their lands painted as dark, chaotic spaces in need of divine order. In Spain, as the Reconquista advanced, Muslims and Jews were described in increasingly monstrous terms, their cultures erased from maps, even as their contributions to science, philosophy, and art endured behind closed doors. Beyond Europe, mapmaking also carried biases. In Chinese cartography, the empire often occupied the center, with foreign lands pushed outward and rendered abstract. Tribute missions were recorded, but the peoples behind them were reduced to names or symbols. The Da Ming Huni II, a famous Ming Dynasty world map,
showed China in detailed relief while Africa and Europe floated vaguely on the periphery. Here too, the map mirrored ideology, affirming centrality, reinforcing hierarchy, and diminishing difference. In the Islamic world, geography followed more scientific principles, with scholars like Idris producing remarkably accurate maps by the standards of the time. Yet even these were shaped by the patronage and worldview of those who commissioned them. Idris's map, drawn for King Roger II of Sicily, placed the south at the top, flipping conventional orientation and subtly challenging European norms. But his descriptions still leaned on hearsay for distant lands, and in some cases adopted the prejudices of other texts, describing some African peoples as irrational or crude, based on earlier Greek sources rather than observation. The true tragedy of these maps is not just in what they included, but in what they omitted. Entire civilizations, the kingdoms of Great Zimbabwe, the empires of Ife and Benin, the city-states of Southeast Asia, were either excluded or marginalized, their complexity rendered invisible. The trade networks that connected Africa, India, and China, the intellectual centers of Timbuktu and Samarkand, the urban sophistication of the Khmer Empire, all were reduced, if acknowledged at all, to vague shapes or exotic labels. To the mapmaker, they were curiosities, not equals. In the end, the maps that survived are not simply artifacts. They are arguments about who matters, who decides, and who is seen. The lines drawn across them helped define the borders not just of land, but of legitimacy. And while the parchment has aged, its consequences linger in how we still imagine the world today. In the bustling centers of medieval life, in city squares echoing with merchants' cries, in caravanserais perfumed with spice and sweat, in port towns where gulls wheeled above creaking ships, trade brought life. It connected distant worlds, moved goods, spread ideas, but beneath the colorful bustle and wealth lay a darker foundation. A marketplace sustained not only by silk and silver, but by blood, coercion, and the quiet exploitation of those who stood just beyond the stalls. Commerce, for all its vibrancy, was never neutral. It served power, and it quietly punished those who could not afford to play by its rules. Markets were central to medieval existence. In Europe, weekly fairs and annual trade festivals gathered buyers and sellers from miles around. Town charters often guaranteed market rights, the legal permission to host trade, and these markets were policed carefully, not just for theft but for social control. Foreign merchants were sometimes welcomed, especially if they brought luxury goods, but they were also taxed heavily, restricted in movement, and blamed quickly if tensions rose. Jews in particular were tolerated for their roles in lending and trade, but were excluded from guilds and prohibited from owning land in many regions. Their participation was essential and reviled all at once, their profits envied, their safety fragile. In Islamic cities, the souk or bazaar was the economic heart, a maze of booths, shaded walkways and narrow alleys. These marketplaces, often organized by product type, were regulated by officials known as mutasib, who monitored weights, prices, and morality. While these systems fostered order and cleanliness, they also enforced religious norms and social hierarchies. Non-Muslim traders were permitted, but often confined to specific quarters and subjected to additional levies. Women could participate, particularly in urban centers like Cairo or Damascus, but social expectations heavily limited their roles, and their wealth was frequently managed through male guardians. Beyond the city centers, trade stretched across dangerous and lonely routes, from the camel trails of the Sahara to the snowy mountain passes of Central Asia. Caravans moved with guards, not just against wild animals,
but against bandits who recognized that wealth on four legs made easy prey. Traders might pass through a dozen territories on a single journey, each demanding bribes or tolls, each presenting risks of arrest, extortion, or disappearance. Hostages were taken when negotiations broke down, goods were impounded, and travelers who fell ill or ran out of coin might simply be left behind. Slavery was an ever-present part of this economic network. While often unmentioned in ledgers, it was understood bodies could be bought alongside spices and incense. In the Mediterranean, enslaved people from Eastern Europe, often Slavs, from whom the word slave is derived, were traded through Genoa, Venice, and Constantinople. Young girls were especially sought after for domestic labor or concubinage. Boys were trained for service or warfare. Their prices fluctuated with supply and demand, and their fates were rarely recorded after purchase. In West Africa, trade routes carried not only salt and gold, but captives. Raids and warfare produced prisoners who were marched north across the desert or sold to coastal traders. Enslaved laborers mined the very gold that funded empires and adorned altars. Few returned. The marketplace valued them as units of labor, not lives. And while African kingdoms often regulated these trades, distinguishing between prisoners of war and freeborn subjects, the human cost remained steep. Families torn apart, languages lost, identities erased. Markets were also sites of public punishment. In towns across Europe, pillories and whipping posts were placed deliberately near the busiest stalls. Justice was made visible, not behind closed doors, but amid the noise of commerce. A thief was beaten while fish were sold. A debtor was jeered while cloth was weighed. This performance of order reinforced power, reminding all who bought and sold that beneath the bustle lay a blade. Money, too, was a source of quiet violence. Coins were clipped, weights adjusted, and poor quality currency flooded the lower classes. In times of war or royal debt, rulers debased their currencies, leading to inflation that destroyed savings and disrupted trade. Peasants had little access to coinage and were often forced into barter or exploitative credit systems. A single bad deal at market could mean hunger for a month. Women, when allowed to trade, faced additional risks. In Europe, widows sometimes continued their late husbands' businesses, but often required male intermediaries. Accusations of fraud or dishonesty were levied more quickly against them. In the Islamic world, wealthy women like Khadija, the Prophet Muhammad's first wife, were held up as models of mercantile virtue, but few outside elite circles reached such positions. Most operated in the shadows of male relatives, their labor essential but uncredited. In every scent of saffron, in every bolt of dyed silk, in every bar of soap or bag of salt, there was more than trade. There was a structure, often invisible, that favored some, crushed others, and ensured that for every open stall, there was someone standing just outside it, watching, waiting, excluded by design. Few symbols of the Middle Ages carry such enduring allure as the knight, the armored horseman, noble in bearing, sworn to protect the weak and uphold honor. Wrapped in tales of courtly love, shining swords, and epic quests, the figure of the medieval knight lives on in literature and legend as an icon of virtue. But behind the gleam of polished steel and the verses of troubadours lay a harsher truth, one shaped by violence, exploitation, and deeply embedded hierarchies. Chivalry, for all its lofty ideals, often served less as a code of justice than as a mask for privilege and brutality. The origins of knighthood were military, not moral. In the early medieval period, knights were essentially mounted enforcers, warriors loyal to local lords, rewarded with land or payment for their service in feuds, raids, and frontier battles. Their primary function was domination, not defense. Armed with the best weapons and training available, they wielded power not just on the battlefield, but over the civilians who lived beneath their rule. In many regions, especially during periods of weak central authority, knights acted as local tyrants, demanding tribute, seizing goods, and punishing dissent without oversight. The concept of chivalry developed slowly, emerging in the 12th century, alongside growing church efforts to restrain knightly violence. The Peace and Truce of God movements attempted to protect clergy, peasants, and the defenseless from the constant warfare between rival nobles. Sermons and councils urged knights to fight only in just causes, to defend pilgrims, uphold oaths, and treat captives with dignity. But these ideals were often more aspirational than actual. Many knights heard them in church, then rode out to burn a rival's village days later. The Crusades, which began in the late 11th century, offered a dramatic test of chivalric ideals and exposed their contradictions. Knights were told they were fighting for God, but they sacked cities, slaughtered civilians, and enriched themselves with looted gold. The massacre at Jerusalem in 1099, where crusaders killed thousands of Muslim and Jewish inhabitants indiscriminately, was justified as divine vengeance. Yet within those same walls, knights prayed before relics and held solemn vigils, believing themselves righteous. In Europe, the knight's code extended only to certain people. Peasants were excluded from its protections. A noble knight might show mercy to a captured aristocrat, ransoming him for profit or honor, but would kill or enslave common soldiers without hesitation. Women were praised in courtly literature, their beauty idolized, their favor courted, yet in practice they were vulnerable to coercion, arranged marriages, and sexual violence. The same knight who knelt in poetic reverence before a noble woman might take a village girl by force on campaign with no consequences from his peers. Tournaments, too, were cloaked in illusion. Presented as demonstrations of skill and pageantry, they were often brutal contests where injuries and deaths were common. These events were less about justice than spectacle, opportunities for knights to display power, win favor, and settle scores under the guise of ritual combat. The rules could be broken, alliances made and betrayed mid-field, and wealth exchanged in wages and rewards. Honor was proclaimed, but victory was the true currency. And then there were the military orders, knight monks like the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic knights, who combined warfare with vows of chastity, poverty, and obedience. They founded hospitals, protected pilgrims, and administered vast territories. But they also waged war, extracted tribute, and imposed rule on conquered populations. The Teutonic Order, in particular, led brutal campaigns against the pagan peoples of the Baltic, destroying villages and enforcing conversions under threat of death. Their white cloaks bore black crosses, symbols of divine mission, but to those beneath their swords, the message was conquest. Chivalry functioned, above all, as a social boundary. It was a way to define who counted, who was noble, who deserved dignity, who was allowed to speak, fight, and be remembered. Common soldiers who displayed bravery received no songs. Women who defended their homes were rarely honored in story. Knights fought for personal gain as often as for justice, and their victories were often measured in plunder, not peace. And yet, the myth endured. Poets and chroniclers, often under the patronage of those very knights, composed romances that softened the bloodshed. They told of Lancelot's honor, Roland's sacrifice, El Cid's loyalty. These stories obscured the real violence of feudal conflict, transforming armored enforcers into paragons of nobility. The code of chivalry became a shield, not to protect the weak,
but to protect the reputation of those in power. Even within the knightly class, not all were equal. Poor knights, younger sons without inheritance, often served wealthier lords in humiliating positions, expected to obey without question and die without land. Some took up mercenary work, fighting for whoever paid, drifting between loyalty and desperation. Others turned to robbery, their status no shield against ruin. The code that bound them was selective, and many found themselves caught in its contradictions.
The cathedrals rise like stone prayers, silent yet soaring, their spires piercing the sky as if to reach the heavens themselves. These Gothic giants, with their stained glass windows, flying buttresses, and echoing choirs, stand as some of the most celebrated achievements of the Middle Ages. They are seen as miracles of faith, testaments to human devotion and divine inspiration. But behind their grandeur lies a story rarely told, a story of anonymous labor, broken bodies and lives spent beneath scaffolds rather than within sanctuaries. For all their beauty, these buildings were born from toil. The construction of a medieval cathedral could take generations. Some took 2 or even 3 centuries to complete. And while bishops and patrons are remembered in carvings and chronicles, the workers who laid the stones, carved the figures, and balanced precariously atop wooden scaffolding are almost entirely forgotten. Their names are not inscribed in chapels. Their stories rarely survived. Yet it was their hands, calloused, cracked, often injured, that made the miracle real. Stonecutters, known as masons, formed the backbone of these projects. They were specialists, often organized into guilds, passing their knowledge down through apprenticeship. Some traveled from site to site, offering their skills where demand called. They worked with simple tools, chisels, hammers, ropes, yet produced vaults and arches that still baffle modern engineers. The precision required was immense. One miscalculation could collapse an entire wall. And while some masons gained modest respect, most labored in obscurity, their pay low, their security uncertain. Accidents were common. A falling block, a snapped rope, a misstep on narrow planks. All could mean death or permanent injury. Carpenters followed closely, building not only the wooden frames and roof beams, but the vast temporary structures needed during construction. Entire forests were felled to support a single cathedral's scaffolding, vault forms and cranes. These timber structures were never meant to be seen. They existed only to allow the stone to rise. Once removed, they left no trace. The labor they represented disappeared with them. Then there were the laborers, men, women, and sometimes children, who carried stones, mixed mortar, dug foundations, and swept debris. Their work was unskilled, their status low, their lives harsh. Some were seasonal workers, others conscripted locals, or those paying off debts through labor. Few could read, fewer still could afford candles to see at night, or boots to protect their feet. They toiled in mud and dust, through rain and heat, for years on end, never seeing the completed structure, never hearing their names echoed through the halls they helped create. Artisans played their part too. Glaziers who fused colored glass into saints and kings, metal workers who cast bells and hinges, painters who gilded altarpieces with gold leaf, made from coins they would never hold. Their work was delicate, devotional, and dangerous. Glass required fire and chemical fumes. Paints were mixed from minerals and animal products, some of them toxic. Bells were cast in molten bronze, poured into molds that had to be shattered to reveal the final form. One misstep could destroy months of work or cost a life. All of this labor was coordinated, not by modern blueprints, but by master builders, individuals who combined artistry, mathematics, engineering, and diplomacy. Many could neither read nor write extensively, yet they calculated load weights,
designed drainage, and negotiated with powerful patrons. Some were eventually honored, most were not. Their sketches, scratched onto parchment or stone walls, have largely vanished, their innovations absorbed into the building, their brilliance uncredited. Funding for these cathedrals came from a mix of sources: church coffers, noble donations, and the pockets of ordinary people. Special taxes were levied, indulgences were sold, guilds contributed as acts of piety. Even the poorest might be asked to give a coin or a chicken toward God's house. Meanwhile, they worshipped in the cold shadow of unfinished walls, waiting decades to hear a proper mass under a roof that would not leak. The truth is, these great buildings, so often seen as spiritual triumphs, were also monuments to inequality. They embodied not only religious devotion, but civic competition and personal vanity. Bishops commissioned larger choirs not for the glory of God alone, but to outshine their rivals. Wealthy patrons paid for chapels in exchange for burial rites, their names carved in stone as insurance for the soul. Even as sermons denounced pride, cathedrals grew taller, more ornate, more impossible, and still the labor continued. No matter how high the nave or how delicate the tracery, the scaffolds rose with it. Each stone lifted, each window placed, was a human act, repeated thousands of times, often without thanks. For the worker laying mortar in the wind, the glory of the finished cathedral was a dream deferred indefinitely, if not forever. In the public squares and along the winding roads outside city walls, medieval justice staged its final act. Executions were not only punishments, they were performances, carefully orchestrated displays meant to terrify, instruct, and affirm the order of things. These were not hidden rituals carried out in hushed silence. They were communal spectacles, attended by hundreds, even thousands, their violence laid bare beneath the open sky. For many, it was the only form of civic ceremony they would ever witness. And though the methods differed across regions, the message was the same: obedience was survival, and disobedience invited the blade, the rope, or the fire. The gallows loomed large in medieval consciousness. In many towns, they were deliberately built in elevated places, hills outside the gates, crossroads, or the entrance to markets, so they could be seen from afar. The sight of a hanging body swaying with the wind served as a lasting reminder of the law's reach. Some gallows were permanent structures, used repeatedly, their wooden beams darkened by time and weather. In others, scaffolds were hastily assembled for specific events, then torn down, leaving only stories in their place. Crimes punishable by death ranged widely, and they were not always what one might expect. Theft, particularly of valuable items or repeated offenses, could result in hanging. So too could arson, treason, and rape. But lesser offenses, poaching, counterfeiting, or even insulting a noble, could be elevated to capital crimes at the discretion of a judge or lord. The law was flexible for those in power and rigid for those without it. Execution methods varied by region and by crime. Hanging was most common in Christian Europe, often carried out with grim ceremony. The condemned was led through town, often barefoot, wearing a simple shift or shirt, accompanied by priests urging last confessions. In some cases, the executioner would grant a final drink, a gesture of cold comfort. The rope itself might be reused many times, its fibers stiff with history. Death by hanging was not always quick. A poorly placed knot, an incorrect drop, and the victim could struggle for minutes, slowly strangling while the crowd looked on. Beheading was considered a more noble death, often reserved for aristocrats or political prisoners. When done well, it was swift. When done poorly, it was gruesome. A blade that bounced, a crowd that gasped,
a body that twitched long after the head had fallen. Executioners trained for years, but even skill could not always ensure mercy. In rare cases, the condemned paid the executioner in advance to guarantee a clean stroke. It was one of the last transactions a person might make. Burning was reserved for crimes considered spiritually dangerous, heresy, sorcery, or sexual offenses judged by religious courts. The condemned were tied to stakes, surrounded by kindling, and either strangled before the fire was lit or left to die in the flames. These events were heavily ritualized, often accompanied by prayers, sermons, and hymns. Inquisitors emphasized not only the destruction of the body, but the purification of the soul, a narrative that cloaked brutality in the language of salvation. In parts of the Islamic world, stoning, crucifixion, or sword execution were practiced, depending on the local interpretation of Sharia and the nature of the crime. As in Europe, these were public acts meant to instruct. Crowds gathered, judgments were recited, and the law affirmed its dominance, not through dialogue, but through the visible annihilation of those who transgressed. In South Asia, executions included hanging, impalement, or in some kingdoms, the crushing of bones by elephants, a method as theatrical as it was terrifying, designed to awe as well as punish. For those forced to witness these deaths, the impact was lasting. Children were brought to executions as lessons in obedience. Vendors sold snacks near the scaffold. Musicians sometimes played as crowds assembled. The condemned might speak final words, or be muzzled if authorities feared dissent. And while the official narrative framed these events as justice, for many onlookers they were complicated, moments of dread, fascination, grief, or even dark humor. Songs were written about famous executions. Carvings depicted them in vivid detail. They became part of communal memory. The role of the executioner was equally paradoxical, both feared and necessary. Often inherited or appointed for life, the executioner lived on the margins of society. He might be denied church sacraments, live in a separate part of town, and be shunned in daily life. Yet he held the power of life and death. His tools were sacred in their way, maintained with reverence. His failures were whispered about for years. Some were brutal, others meticulous. All carried the weight of their office silently. But executions were not only about law-breaking, they also reinforced hierarchy. A noble who rebelled might be beheaded with full ceremony, his family allowed to bury him with honor. A peasant who stole grain might hang nameless, his body left for birds. The crowd saw both and absorbed the difference. Justice was not blind. It watched carefully and delivered punishment accordingly. Behind the grand tapestries and high stone walls of medieval manors and castles, where nobles dined in candlelit halls and prayers echoed in private chapels, another class moved almost invisibly: the servants. They fetched the water, stoked the fires, dressed the lords, scrubbed the floors, and disappeared into silence. Without them, the machinery of elite life would collapse. Yet their stories are rarely told, their names seldom recorded. They existed not as characters in medieval chronicles, but as tools within them, present, necessary, and ultimately replaceable. Servitude in the Middle Ages was not a monolith. It came in many forms, from domestic service in noble households to field work on large estates, from personal attendants to the invisible workers who toiled in kitchens, stables, and cellars. Some servants were free, working for wages or room and board. Others were bound by contract or debt. Many were children, apprenticed into service from a young age, often as a form of social advancement or survival. Their roles might begin with minor chores but quickly expanded to include intimate and physically taxing responsibilities. And for many, there was no clear line between employment and subjugation. In noble houses, the structure of servanthood mirrored the feudal order itself. At the top were stewards, chamberlains, and seneschals, educated men who managed finances, inventories, and communication. Below them were cooks, maids, grooms, pages, laundresses, and scullions. Tasks were divided by rank and gender, but nearly all involved long hours, limited rest, and strict discipline. A single misstep, breaking a dish, spilling wine, failing to wake a lord on time, could result in punishment or dismissal. Praise was rare, gratitude rarer still. Domestic servants were always present, but never expected to speak freely. They overheard the secrets of their masters, witnessed betrayals, and stood quietly while decisions about war, marriage, and inheritance were made just feet away. Their silence was both expected and enforced. In many households, a servant caught repeating private matters could be beaten or turned out without payment. Trust was fragile, surveillance was constant. Women in service faced additional dangers. For a maid or chamber servant, proximity to powerful men brought risk of harassment or assault. Few protections existed. If a nobleman forced himself on a servant, the likelihood of consequences was minimal, especially if the woman became pregnant. In some cases, she was quietly dismissed. In others, she was forced to remain and continue her work, shamed and watched. Children born from such encounters were often sent away or absorbed into lower ranks of service. These stories rarely made it into official records, yet they shaped generations of lives. In monasteries and convents, the same patterns appeared. Lay brothers and sisters, distinct from the ordained, performed menial labor, tending gardens, maintaining buildings, cooking meals, with little voice in the decisions of the community. In wealthier abbeys, hired labor supplemented monastic work, especially during harvest or construction. These workers slept in separate quarters, ate different food, and followed different rules. They kept the rhythm of holy life intact, but rarely shared in its privileges. Castles offered no escape. Though often romanticized as places of refinement, their daily operation was grueling and relentless. Servants awoke before dawn to light fires and prepare meals, and worked long past dusk, cleaning, mending, and waiting on guests. During times of siege or unrest, they were often the first to suffer, exposed to violence, hunger, or disease without the protections afforded to their lords. Some were forced to fight, not with sword and armor, but by carrying supplies, boiling water for defense, or burying the dead. Despite this, many clung to service as a path to security. A position in a wealthy household meant food, shelter, and at least temporary protection. For some, it offered a glimpse of advancement, the chance to learn to read, to gain patronage, to marry into a higher status. Yet the door to mobility remained narrow. A lifetime of loyalty could be undone by a single accusation. A widow could be dismissed without pension. An aging servant too slow to keep up might find herself alone and destitute. Wills and household accounts offer fleeting glimpses of these individuals: a trusted valet, a faithful cook, a girl who served at table, but rarely more than that. Their lives, rich with emotion, sacrifice, and endurance, remain largely invisible behind the grandeur they maintained. Even in literature, servants were often caricatures: foolish, cowardly, comic, never fully human. Their dignity was private, carved out in whispered friendships, small kindnesses, and the quiet pride of a job done well, even if unnoticed. The truth behind the elegance of medieval high society
is that it rested on a foundation of unacknowledged labor. Every embroidered tunic, every polished floor, every steaming feast was the result of invisible hands. Hands that cleaned, cooked, carried, and obeyed without applause. And when the feast ended, when the guests departed, those same hands swept the crumbs from beneath the table in the quiet hours before dawn.
There are few moments in human history that altered the medieval world as abruptly and as irreversibly as the arrival of the plague. It moved with the wind, on the backs of rats and in the lungs of the living, spreading faster than understanding could follow. The Black Death, which struck Europe in the mid-14th century, is remembered in numbers, tens of millions dead, entire villages erased, labor markets transformed. But behind the statistics lies a quieter, more intimate devastation. The silences that followed, the absences that became part of daily life, the grief that never found language. For those who survived, the world that remained was not just emptier, it was disoriented. The plague did not arrive all at once. It came in waves, carried by trade routes that stretched from the steppes of Central Asia to the ports of the Mediterranean. It likely began in the east, perhaps in the region of the Mongol Empire, where rodent populations thrived and nomadic communities moved frequently. Some accounts suggest that the disease followed the Silk Road, spreading through merchant caravans and military expeditions. By the time it reached the Crimea in the early 1340s, it had already begun to change shape, leaping from fleas to humans, then from lungs to lungs. In 1347, it arrived in Europe, first in Sicily, then Marseille, Genoa, and beyond. Within 2 years, it had touched nearly every corner of the continent. The death came quickly. Fever, swelling, delirium, blackened skin. Some died within a day, others lingered in agony. Priests refused last rites. Families abandoned the sick. Mass graves filled faster than they could be dug. In cities, entire neighborhoods fell silent. The only sound the tolling of bells or the creak of plague carts on stone. The social order collapsed in places. Officials fled their posts. Guilds shut their doors. Even the rhythms of burial unraveled. Coffins became rare, prayers shorter, ceremonies omitted altogether. In Avignon, the Pope consecrated the Rhone River so that corpses thrown into its current would still receive divine blessing. In Siena, the chronicler Agnolo di Tura buried his 5 children with his own hands. He wrote that no one wept, because everyone expected to die. And yet, even in the midst of horror, people sought explanations. Some blamed the stars, others pointed to poisoned wells, to foul air, to divine wrath. Jewish communities became frequent scapegoats. In towns from Mainz to Barcelona, rumors spread that Jews had caused the plague through sorcery or conspiracy. Pogroms followed. Entire communities were burned, expelled, or massacred. In Strasbourg, over 1,000 Jews were killed in a single day. Few dared to speak out. Fear made silence complicit. Flagellant movements swept through parts of Germany and the Low Countries. Bands of penitents who marched from town to town, whipping themselves in the streets, believing that suffering could appease God's anger. At first, they were tolerated, but as their numbers grew and their teachings veered toward heresy, the church moved to suppress them. Still, their chants echoed through dying cities. Christus vincit, Christus regnat, Christus regnat, Christ conquers, Christ reigns, a cry of hope, wrapped in pain. In the Islamic world, the plague struck as well, moving through Persia, Syria, and North Africa. In Cairo, as many as 1,000 people died per day at the peak. The great scholar Ibn Khaldun lost his parents to the disease, and later wrote that entire lineages and knowledge traditions had been severed. In Mecca and Baghdad, prayers were held for relief, but the sickness did not discriminate. The devout and the indifferent fell alike.
Rural communities were devastated, entire villages vanished, their fields returning to forest, their names forgotten, churches stood empty, bells stopped ringing. In England alone, over a third of the population is believed to have died. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors spoke of ghost towns, of neighbors whose doors never reopened, of animals roaming untended. Even the air seemed changed, heavier, quieter, marked by the absence of life. Yet in the ruins, new possibilities stirred. With fewer laborers, wages rose, serfs negotiated better terms. Some fled to towns, seeking freedom beyond their lord's reach. Women entered trades once closed to them. Monastic lands were leased to commoners. A new fluidity unsettled the old order. But these changes came unevenly, and often with violence. Nobles tried to freeze wages. Governments passed laws against migration. Rebellions flared. Most famously the English peasants' revolt of 1381, which was crushed with brutal efficiency. Art and literature changed too. Death appeared more frequently in paintings, skeletal figures dancing with the living in the dance macabre, corpses rising from graves in judgment scenes. Writers like Boccaccio captured the terror in the Decameron, while mystics described visions of flame and emptiness. The world had ended, not with fire or thunder, but with a cough, a fever, and an empty chair at the table. The plague did not vanish. It returned in waves for centuries, striking again and again, but none were as fierce or as defining as that first outbreak. It reshaped demography, economics, memory, and belief. And though history counts its toll in numbers, its deepest mark was silence, the absence that lingered in homes, in streets, in song.
For all its armored knights, fortified walls, and sacred relics, the medieval world remained at the mercy of nature. No matter how high the towers climbed or how solemn the prayers rang, the earth beneath was not stable, and the waters never still. Climate, though rarely mentioned in chronicles with the same reverence as kings or saints, played a quiet and devastating role in shaping the lives of those who tilled the soil and huddled against the wind. Long before modern terms like Little Ice Age were coined, the people of the Middle Ages knew what it meant for the seasons to betray them. The early medieval period, roughly from 800 to 1200 CE, enjoyed a relatively warm phase in Europe, known now as the medieval warm period. Crops thrived in many regions. Vineyards grew in places once too cold. Norse settlers farmed the green edges of Iceland and even parts of Greenland. But prosperity balanced on a delicate edge, and by the late 13th century, that balance began to shift. Temperatures cooled, rains became unpredictable, and a slow environmental decline set in. What followed was not a single disaster, but a long descent into scarcity, punctuated by floods, failed harvests, and freezing winters that reshaped human fate. One of the clearest markers of this transformation was the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. Torrential rains fell across northern Europe for years, soaking fields and rotting grain. Roads turned to mud, hay could not be harvested, livestock drowned or starved. Salt, essential for preserving meat, became scarce. Entire herds perished, and with them the fragile protein supply for countless villages. Chroniclers described starving people digging up graves, children abandoned by the roadside, and entire families reduced to eating bark, roots, and even each other. Yet what's often forgotten is that the famine was not a single moment, but a sign of broader instability. In the Netherlands and along the coasts of northern Germany, the sea took on a darker role. Rising tides and storm surges overwhelmed low-lying settlements, many of which had been painstakingly reclaimed from the ocean by dikes and drainage. In 1362, the Grote Mandrenki, the Great Drowning of Men, swept across the North Sea. It killed tens of thousands, submerged entire towns, and permanently altered coastlines. Some settlements vanished beneath the waves, never rebuilt. In Friesland and East Anglia, generations of work were undone in a single night. Fields that had fed hundreds returned to salt marsh. It was not merely a storm, but a reassertion of nature's dominion. Further east, the steppe and forest zones experienced climatic seesaws that struck at the heart of empire. In the Mongol domains, droughts disrupted grazing patterns, destabilizing the movements of horse-herding peoples and sparking conflicts over pasture. In China, the cooling trend contributed to crop failures and flooding along the Yellow River. Dynastic authorities struggled to feed their populations. As harvests shrank and rebellions grew, the mandate of heaven, the divine justification for rule, frayed and regimes changed hands with growing violence. The Nile, lifeblood of Egypt, was not spared. Its annual floods, essential for farming, became erratic. Too little water meant parched fields and famine. Too much brought destruction and displacement. In Cairo, scholars tracked these fluctuations with concern, linking natural disasters to the moral decay of rulers and subjects alike. But for the peasant, explanations mattered less than survival. A failed flood meant a hungry year. 2 in a row meant death. People responded in ways both practical and desperate. Some built new flood defenses, digging channels and reinforcing dikes. Others migrated, abandoning exhausted land for forest margins or urban slums. Religious responses grew more intense. In Europe, processions of barefoot penitents wound through towns, begging divine mercy for failed crops. In Japan, droughts and frosts were sometimes interpreted as signs of cosmic imbalance, prompting temple rituals and offerings to placate angry spirits. The church, increasingly entangled in political concerns, struggled to offer comfort. Its assurances of a divinely ordered universe rang hollow in the face of starving congregations. Some began to question not only the morality of rulers, but the reliability of the heavens themselves. If the seasons could no longer be trusted, then what remained stable? This quiet erosion of trust would echo through later centuries, paving the way for more radical doubts. But even in the face of environmental collapse, life continued. People adapted, crops shifted. In some places, hardier grains replaced delicate ones. In Scandinavia, settlements contracted, but did not vanish. In the Alps, high-altitude villages adjusted planting cycles, experimented with new tools, and turned more toward herding. Yet these adaptations favored those with flexibility, and the poor, as always, bore the brunt. For them, the margin for error shrank with every cold spring or rainy harvest. The myth of the stable medieval countryside, green fields, contented peasants, cyclical seasons, obscures a much harsher truth. The earth was not passive. It could betray as quickly as it could bless. And when it did, no charter, no title, no relic could halt the flood or stop the snow. In this world, power did not mean immunity. It meant only the chance to suffer a little later. In the medieval imagination, few things held more power than holiness. The sacred was not abstract. It was tangible, alive in the bones of saints, in splinters of the true cross, in drops of blood preserved in glass. Relics, physical remains or possessions of holy figures, were believed to heal the sick, protect cities, grant victories, and draw pilgrims from across the known world. Cathedrals rose to house them. Wars were fought to obtain them. But beneath the incense and adoration lay a system not just of devotion, but of profit, fraud, and manipulation. A spiritual economy in which the sacred was often sold to the highest bidder. Pilgrimage was one of the most widespread religious practices of the medieval era. From Santiago de Compostela in Spain to Canterbury in England, from Mecca to Kashi, people walked for weeks or months to visit sites believed to hold divine power. At these shrines, the devout left offerings, coins, jewelry, clothing, and sometimes received tokens in return: a badge, a vial of holy water, a piece of cloth that had touched the relic. The journey was framed as penance, as a path to forgiveness or healing, but it was also a booming business. Churches that possessed powerful relics attracted enormous wealth. Inns, taverns, merchants and moneylenders thrived along pilgrimage routes. Donations poured in. Some cities owed their survival not to kings or crops, but to the steady traffic of pilgrims. And so the competition for relics intensified. Bishops petitioned Rome for saints' bones. Monasteries claimed miraculous finds. Entire villages fabricated stories of divine apparitions. The more dramatic the tale, the more likely the crowds and the coin would follow. Forgery became an open secret. Traders sold relics at fairs, offering bits of cloth allegedly from the Virgin Mary's robe, thorns from Christ's crown, or even milk from the breast of the Madonna. Bones were particularly suspect. With so many churches claiming skulls of John the Baptist, it became a joke even among the devout. One for every year of his life, some quipped. Yet the trade continued. People wanted to believe, and belief itself became a currency. Some relics were stolen in what was euphemistically called furta sacra, or holy theft. In these cases, a monastery or city would justify stealing a relic by arguing that the saint wished to be moved. Stories were invented in which the saint refused to perform miracles until relocated. The new custodians, convinced of divine approval, would parade the relic through their streets in triumph. The old guardians were left grieving and powerless. These were not minor disagreements. They were theological kidnappings, justified by dreams and visions, enforced by swords and locks. The church attempted at times to regulate this system. Councils were convened to identify fraudulent relics, and inquisitors were occasionally tasked with investigating false miracles. But these efforts were inconsistent and often undermined by local politics. A relic that attracted pilgrims and their offerings was too valuable to lose. Even dubious claims were tolerated if they served stability. Faith, after all, was as much about cohesion as about truth. And relics held political power. Kings and emperors collected them as symbols of legitimacy. Charlemagne amassed an extraordinary number, using them to sanctify his rule. The Byzantine emperors boasted entire treasuries of relics, which they paraded on feast days to reinforce their divine favor. During the Crusades, relics were looted from Constantinople and brought to the West, a spiritual plunder that reshaped the religious map of Europe. Even in the chaos of battle, relics were carried into the field, believed to offer protection and victory. But the people who lived closest to these relics, the caretakers, the sacristans, the beggars who clustered around the shrines, knew another side of the story. They saw the rivalries between clergy, the fights over donations, the miracles that didn't come. They saw the relics locked away behind gold and glass, inaccessible, without payment or favor. They watched pilgrims crawl on their knees toward altars, desperate for healing, only to return home unchanged and poorer. They lived in the gap between promise and reality. Women, too, played a complex role in this economy of faith. Female mystics were sometimes revered as living saints, their visions attracting crowds and controversy. Yet when their revelations challenged authority, they were silenced. Some were accused of heresy or madness. Others were absorbed into male-dominated institutions that controlled how their words were recorded and shared.
Their bodies, like relics, were treated as vessels of divine power, but not always with dignity. And still, people believed. They traveled through mud and hunger to touch a coffin, to light a candle, to feel for a moment that the world held meaning beyond suffering. The line between deception and devotion was thin and not always easy to draw. Some faked miracles out of greed. Others believed in them so deeply that the act itself became real. In this world, the sacred was never entirely pure. It was layered with longing, desperation, politics, and need. The bones behind the altar were not just symbols. They were reminders that even holiness in the medieval world came at a price.
To live on the margins of the medieval world was to live in a space both feared and forgotten. While kings wrote laws and bishops built cathedrals, there were whole populations who existed beyond the reach and often beyond the concern of official history. Nomads, forest dwellers, traveling tradespeople, and those labeled outsiders carved lives from the land in ways that defied the settled, ordered vision of kings and chroniclers. And though they were often seen as lesser, dangerous, or invisible, these communities played vital, if largely unacknowledged, roles in the shaping of the world around them. One of the most misunderstood groups of the medieval era were the Romani, commonly referred to in later centuries by a name now recognized as a slur, but at the time seen as foreign wanderers from the East. Their precise origins are debated, but linguistic and genetic studies suggest they migrated from the Indian subcontinent around a millennium ago, moving slowly westward through Persia and into Europe by the late Middle Ages. By the 14th century, Romani communities were appearing in the Balkans, Italy, and even parts of France and Germany. They were often received with fascination, suspicion, and sometimes violence. Traveling in family groups, speaking dialects unfamiliar to local ears, and offering services as metal workers, musicians, and fortune tellers, the Romani quickly drew attention. Local authorities struggled to categorize them. Some cities offered them charters and protection, others expelled them outright. They were accused of theft, sorcery, and deceit, charges levied not because of evidence, but because of unfamiliarity. The Romani became mirrors for local anxieties, their mobility seen not as freedom but as threat. And yet, their knowledge of routes, horses, and materials made them indispensable to many rural economies. They repaired tools, traded in rare goods, and passed news across borders where no courier could safely travel. Further north and east, in the forests of Russia and the Baltics, lived communities of hunter-gatherers and forest farmers, groups who paid little heed to the claims of princes and popes. The Slavic-speaking Velati and the Finno-Ugric peoples survived largely outside the structures of feudalism, organizing their lives by clan and season. Christian missionaries pushed into these territories with increasing force during the High Middle Ages, often accompanied by armed conversion campaigns. Yet resistance persisted, not always through open war, but through evasion, refusal, and the quiet continuity of tradition. In Ireland and Scotland, Gaelic-speaking clans continued to resist English and Norman control well into the late medieval period. Many lived in mountainous or marshy areas that defied easy governance. Their legal systems, based on oral tradition and kinship compensation, were dismissed as barbaric by outsiders. Yet these systems often provided nuanced and flexible forms of justice, ones that recognized honor, community standing, and reconciliation over rigid punishment. To the south, in the mountainous regions of the Balkans, Albania and Armenia, similar patterns unfolded. Highland communities developed unique social codes, often based on honor and revenge, that clashed with imperial ideals. Central authorities, whether Byzantine, Ottoman, or Latin, found these groups difficult to subdue. When diplomacy failed, they were often portrayed as heretics or brigands, making military campaigns against them seem morally justified. But many were simply people living as they had for generations, loyal to land and kin over distant rulers. Jews, too, often lived on the edge, not geographically but socially, forced into ghettos or restricted districts, excluded from many professions, and banned from owning land in numerous kingdoms. Jewish communities became deeply self-sufficient. They developed legal systems, schools, and networks of mutual aid. Rabbis served not just as spiritual leaders but as judges, scholars, and diplomats. Yet their autonomy was fragile. A new king, a bad harvest, or a plague could bring destruction. Expulsions were frequent, pogroms sudden, and still they rebuilt, again and again, always at the margins of societies that needed them, yet never fully accepted them. Even within empires there were margins. In the Islamic world, zimmis protected non-Muslims, including Christians, Jews, and Zoroastrians, paid special taxes in exchange for safety. In theory, their rights were clear. In practice, enforcement varied. Some communities flourished, contributing to science, translation, and trade. Others were periodically harassed, relocated, or impoverished. In the Ottoman Balkans, for example, Christian peasants often lived under the authority of local Muslim landholders, creating systems of coexistence that were both tense and complex. Women often lived on the edge in another way, not by geography, but by visibility. Widows without sons, midwives without patrons, women accused of unapproved knowledge or behavior, all could find themselves pushed to the margins of their towns or villages. Some turned to the forest, others to the road. A few survived by becoming wandering healers or herbalists, trading their knowledge for food or protection. And in times of unrest, these same women were often scapegoated, cast as witches or outlaws, their marginality reframed as malevolence. While chronicles detailed the deeds of kings and popes, and artists etched the likenesses of saints and soldiers, the vast machinery of medieval life turned quietly through the hands of women, largely unseen, seldom acknowledged, and almost never celebrated. Their labor fed the hungry, clothed the poor, and kept homes warm through bitter winters. It raised children, brewed ale, spun thread, cared for the sick, and tilled soil beside men, in fields where rank and gender rarely mattered when hunger loomed. Yet in the stories that survived, their presence was reduced to shadows, their contributions framed as natural, expected, and therefore undeserving of recognition. Women's work was foundational. In rural villages, they managed the home economy, which was far more complex than the phrase suggests. They prepared food from raw, unprocessed ingredients, grinding grain by hand, churning butter, baking bread in communal ovens, drying herbs, preserving fruits, and salting meat when available. They gathered fuel, tended gardens, mended clothing, and raised poultry. All of this was done alongside childcare, often with multiple children underfoot, and in many cases while pregnant. These tasks were not optional, and they were not leisurely. A delay in gathering firewood meant no heat. A missed hour in the garden could mean less food for winter. The margin between comfort and calamity was thin. In towns and cities, women participated in markets, selling dairy, textiles, candles, baked goods, and other household wares. Many worked as spinners or weavers, especially in regions like Flanders or Italy, where cloth production dominated the economy. Some belonged to craft guilds, though access was often restricted by gendered rules. A widow might inherit her husband's workshop and tools, only to be required to remarry a guild member to keep operating. Brewing, one of the essential trades of medieval Europe, was dominated by women for centuries. Known as alewives, they produced beer in small batches for local sale. Brewing was labor-intensive and carried social risk. Spoiled ale could lead to fines, public shame, or lost livelihood. Some communities accused women brewers of watering their product or using herbs associated with sorcery. As male-controlled guilds began to dominate beer production in the later Middle Ages, women were gradually pushed out, their skills dismissed, their reputations smeared. Medicine, too, lay in women's hands. While universities barred women from formal study, folk healing and midwifery were domains where female knowledge persisted. Midwives not only delivered children, but managed pregnancies, herbal remedies, and postnatal care. In many regions they were respected, consulted even by clergy and lords. But the same knowledge that granted them authority also made them vulnerable. Sexual violence, largely unpunished, shaped the boundaries of women's mobility and speech. In noble courts, marriages were arranged not for love, but for land, lineage, or peace. Girls as young as 12 were married off, their consent irrelevant. In poorer households, women worked alongside men, but had fewer rights to property, fewer paths to legal recourse, and almost no protection against domestic abuse. Divorce was rare and often forbidden. A woman who fled a cruel husband might be branded a criminal herself. Her options narrowed not by her lack of will, but by the laws that refused her agency. Religious life offered both refuge and constraint. In convents, women could read, write, and teach, especially in orders like the Benedictines or Cistercian. Some female mystics rose to prominence, their visions recorded and preserved. Yet even in the cloister, autonomy was limited. Abbesses answered to male bishops. Nuns required permission to travel or correspond, and when visions contradicted doctrine, or when convents became too influential, church authorities intervened swiftly. The silence of the vow was not always freely chosen. Art and literature, though largely male-dominated, contained glimpses of women's lives, in margins, in poems, in private letters. A woman's voice might be heard in a lullaby passed from mother to daughter, in a carved spindle handle, or in the stitching of an altar cloth signed with initials too modest for memory. These traces tell us that women not only worked, but created, imagined, and endured with intelligence and strength that the official record rarely honors. Even rebellion had a female face. During uprisings like the Jacquerie in France, or the English Peasants' Revolt, women fought beside men, wielded pitchforks, torches, and stones. In city riots, they looted bakeries, marched in protest, and protected their neighborhoods when officials fled. Chroniclers often dismissed them as hysterical or unnatural, but the rage they carried was not confusion. It was clarity born of exhaustion. The deeper truth of women's work in the Middle Ages is that it never truly ended. It was continuous, cyclic, and often invisible. It was expected to happen without complaint and without pause, through sickness, pregnancy, mourning, and poverty. And when it did not happen, the world faltered. Crops failed, children starved, cloth unraveled. Yet the hands that held it all together, rough, calloused, tired, rarely made it into the stories told by men. In the colder corners of the medieval imagination, where fear mingled with ritual and rumor, a new figure slowly emerged, cloaked in secrecy, marked by suspicion, and ultimately hunted through fire and accusation. The witch, as we recognize her today, did not spring fully formed from ancient folklore. She was built gradually, shaped by theology, law, misogyny, and anxiety. Her story is not one of ancient pagan defiance alone, but of power's need to find a target when the world refused to bend to reason. And behind every whispered accusation stood someone poor, vulnerable, or merely inconvenient. For much of the early Middle Ages, belief in magic and supernatural forces was widespread, but loosely defined. Folk healers, midwives, and charm makers operated throughout villages and towns, often blending Christian rites with older customs. The Church, in its early efforts to Christianize Europe, tolerated many of these practices, framing them as superstition rather than heresy. As long as they did not overtly contradict doctrine, small rituals and protective spells were seen as the remnants of a simpler time, not ideal, but not dangerous. That changed slowly. As church authority consolidated and literacy expanded, a new concern took root, that magic was not simply ignorance but rebellion, not just error, but intentional sin. Theologians began to redefine the idea of sorcery. By the 12th century, intellectuals in university cities like Paris and Bologna proposed that some magic was not merely false, but powered by demonic forces. It wasn't simply that someone believed in charms, it was that they were making a pact, consciously or not, with the devil himself. This shift was subtle at first. Church councils condemned harmful magic and the invocation of spirits, especially in the context of love potions, fertility rites, or curses. But as the Inquisition developed in the 13th century, tools were put in place to investigate, try, and punish those accused of spiritual crimes. Heresy became an official legal category, and as this machinery expanded, it found new subjects to pursue. The idea of the witch as a specific female threat took form over time. Women were more often accused than men, not because they practiced more magic, but because their social position made them easier targets. Widows, spinsters, midwives, and poor women living alone were particularly vulnerable. If crops failed, if livestock sickened, if children died unexpectedly, suspicion could fall quickly. A single quarrel, a strange look, or the possession of herbs and unfamiliar tools might be enough to ignite fear. By the late 1400s, that fear found its most infamous expression in Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, a treatise written by two Dominican inquisitors and published in 1487. Though technically after the High Medieval period, the book codified ideas that had been brewing for centuries. It argued that witches were real, that they were women by nature more carnal and deceitful than men, and that they should be identified, tortured, and executed without hesitation. It was widely read, reprinted, and used to justify trials for generations. Its influence outlived its century and its cruelty. Witch trials in the Middle Ages were fewer than those of the later early modern period, but they were no less harrowing. Inquisitors interrogated suspects under threat or torture. Confessions were extracted, names of alleged accomplices demanded, and entire webs of imagined evil spun from a single complaint. Accused women might be stripped and examined for the witch's mark, a spot supposedly insensitive to pain. They might be dunked in water, bound and thrown into rivers to see if they floated. If they did, it was proof of guilt. If they sank, they were innocent, but often drowned. These were not fringe phenomena. In France, Germany, and parts of Italy, such trials were supported by both secular and ecclesiastical courts. Some bishops tried to limit the hysteria, but others encouraged it. The state saw witch trials as a tool to reinforce order. Communities used them to settle scores. The church saw them as a way to root out spiritual decay, and the accused were rarely strangers. They were neighbors, mothers, elderly women who had helped deliver children or offered herbal remedies. Sometimes they were young girls. Sometimes they confessed simply to end the pain. Sometimes they named others to delay their own deaths. And sometimes they went to the stake in silence. Outside Europe, accusations of sorcery or spiritual danger took different forms. In parts of West Africa, those believed to possess dangerous spiritual power
were sometimes exiled or subjected to community rituals of purification. In Islamic jurisprudence, sorcery was condemned, but rarely prosecuted with the same fervor as in Christian Europe. In South Asia and China, folk magic persisted through centuries of dynastic change, often blending with religious practice. But even in these regions, women bore the weight of suspicion more heavily, seen as both spiritually potent and morally precarious. To be called a witch in the Middle Ages was to be caught in a story you didn't write, a tale of fear, faith, and projection. And once the tale began, there was often no way to change its ending.
In the end, what we know of the Middle Ages comes not only from what was written, but from what was preserved and what was chosen. The illuminated manuscripts, the royal charters, the sermons and chronicles that survived into the present day tell us much about how power spoke, how faith declared, and how order was imagined. But they tell us less about how most people lived, suffered, coped, and hoped. The true darkness of the medieval period is not only in its cruelty or hardship, but in how much of it unfolded in silence, unnoticed, unrecorded, unremembered. The vast majority of people who lived between the fall of Rome and the rise of modern states never saw their names etched into stone. They left no written record. They appear in archives only as numbers, victims, laborers, or offenders. Their inner lives, their fears, their loves, their quiet joys are barely traceable. We see them only through the distorted lenses of others, the tax records, the court documents, the occasional marginal note in a monk's diary. They emerge in brief glimmers: a peasant who planted an orchard on someone else's land, a mother who risked punishment to keep her child out of service, a boy whose name was recorded once in a list of plague victims and then never again. The forgotten, however, built the medieval world. They dug the ditches, thatched the roofs, and shaped the iron. They guided ships through foggy harbors. They walked for weeks to bring a relic from one shrine to another. They whispered lullabies over infants who might not survive the winter. They taught songs, passed down superstitions, brewed medicine from weeds, and carved prayers into stone not meant to last. They endured floods, famines, unjust rulers, and arbitrary laws. And still they adapted, survived, and passed something on. The picture we inherit of the Middle Ages is often shaped by contradiction, by romantic illusions of chivalry and courtly love, by grim tales of plague and fire. But most of life happened between these extremes. It took place in kitchens, fields, alleys, and workshops. It involved compromise and routine, not constant drama. Yet that daily struggle, that effort to find meaning and survival in a world so often indifferent, was no less profound. Some of the most revealing truths come not from the grand events, but from the gaps. The erased names in a monastery's necrology, the fragments of cloth found in graves, the worn handles of tools used for generations. These are the artifacts of a humanity that was rarely deemed worthy of record, yet without which none of the rest would have been possible. Behind every bishop's mitre was a washerwoman who boiled his linens. Behind every royal procession was a servant who cleaned up the manure. Behind every manuscript was a sheepskin scraped and stretched by someone we will never know. Even the most literate among the elites were limited in what they imagined. Few chroniclers recorded the thoughts of the enslaved, the colonized, the disabled, or the deeply poor. Fewer still paused to reflect on how systems they took for granted, serfdom, patriarchy, religious persecution, shaped every layer of life. What we inherit, therefore, is a skewed archive, sharp in detail when it comes to battles and bishops, vague and shadowed when it comes to birth, hunger, grief, and resistance. Yet from these shadows, patterns emerge. We learn that violence was often systemic, not exceptional. That faith was lived more often in fear than in peace. That the body, especially the bodies of women, the poor, and the outcast, was a site of constant control. And that beauty, resilience, and even rebellion flowered not in palaces, but in hovels, in courtyards, in chants, sung softly under one's breath, while walking alone. The Middle Ages were not monolithic. They varied across continents and centuries. Life in 13th century Mali was not the same as life in 10th century Iceland or 15th century Delhi. Yet across this diverse tapestry, certain themes return: the fragility of justice, the struggle for autonomy, the endurance of belief in the face of hardship, and the quiet, persistent dignity of those who lived without fame. To study the darker truths of the Middle Ages is not to condemn them, nor to pretend that cruelty and inequality were unique to that era. Rather, it is to strip away the myth of simple golden ages or clear moral hierarchies. It is to see history not as a parade of heroes, but as a long, uneven terrain, walked mostly by people whose names we'll never know, people who lived, worked, feared, and loved with the same depth as any of us. And perhaps the most haunting truth of all is this: that much of what they left behind lies not in the annals of kings, but in the dirt beneath our feet, in the words they could not write, and in the faint traces of lives lived fully, even if briefly, in the dark.